All right, welcome to Transit Funding and Governance Commission meeting. I appreciate how well you all came to order. That is very, very impressive, so thank you. Appreciate the commission members who are here today. I know, talked to Commissioner McMurray this morning. He had another meeting at 9:30, and he's going to come over after that. And Chairman Nash from Gwinnett County also is going to be on the way as soon as she can, but she had a little emergency come up this morning that she had to handle. Before we get started, I'm going to ask our Chairman Shaw and our future Public Service Commissioner here in just a few weeks, Chairman Shaw, to say a quick blessing for us, prayer for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If you will, join me in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for bringing us here together all this morning, for all bringing us here safely, Lord. We ask you to continue to be with us from that safety standpoint as we return home later today. We ask you to be with us as we discuss matters that are important to rural Georgians, and we just thank you for all that you've done to allow us to get to this point, Lord. Thank you for Chairman Tanner and everyone that has worked so hard to get us here and what we've been able to accomplish with this commission the last couple of years, Lord. We just ask you to continue to be with us, give us the wisdom that we need to do the right thing, Lord, as we wrap this year up with the work of the commission. Lord, just continue to guide, guard, and protect each and every one of us and our families, and let us not forget the true meaning of this season, Lord, as we celebrate the birth of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Lord, continue to be with us. We love you. Thank you. Amen.
Amen. All right, thank you, Chairman. We have a question, Chairman Taylor.
No, I just wanted to say, in the spirit of Jason's thing there, we had a DeKalb County police officer killed the other day, 2 days short of his 25th birthday. I know Mayor Margaret and I are probably going to be at the funeral tomorrow. Super guy, just doing his job, but lost his life in the line of duty, and I'd like to just have a moment of silence for him.
Yeah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I believe he was a UNG graduate too, and grew up there in North Georgia. Yeah. All right. Law enforcement's a tough profession. We have a lot of folks out there protecting us on a daily basis here at home and abroad. So thank you for their service and their sacrifice. Just echoing what Chairman Shaw also said in his prayer about the work of the commission, I want to take just a moment to thank each one of you as we come to a close of another year for all of your work. We've been at it for 2 years, and we've had a great deal to accomplish, and we've made great headway. So with House Bill 930 and with the work we've done this year, so I want to thank each one of you for your service. We've traveled around the state, and it's taken a lot of time, both in the commission meetings, but also outside of that, and could not have asked for a better group of people for the speaker to appoint from all across the state. So thank you for your service to the commission, but more importantly to the state. You can see there in front of you today's agenda. We're going to recap just a little bit, and then we're going to go into Brian Anderson had a workforce development subcommittee down in Macon a week or two ago. That was very productive, and he's going to spend 30 minutes or so and then 15 minutes of Q&A talking through that and bringing us up to speed on what they learned in their subcommittee meeting. Appreciate you, Brian, for doing that for us and for your efforts in that area. That's one thing about this commission, and Brian's a perfect example of that, one of the leaders in that area in the state, so we appreciate his efforts. And then Brianna Wilson's going to spend some time from Southern Point Staffing with a presentation for us today, talking about their work and the needs for transit services outside this metro area all across the state. Then we'll have a little bit of time for lunch, and then this afternoon we're going to come back and spend some time updating our recommendations. If you remember at our last meeting that we had down in Dublin, we talked through some recommendations. Took your feedback both in the meeting and outside the meeting, and to further define that and to look at what we're going to be looking at as we move forward into legislation next session. And then again, that's talking about the commission discussion of the 2019 legislative session and looking at next steps. So that'll get us through today's meeting. This will show you a little bit of a timeline of where we are today. see where we come from and where we are. December, of course, this is a meeting to identify legislation for next year. We'll also take what we our work today and then go into January. We'll have a meeting right around the first of the legislative session where we'll pull together from House Research, Deloitte, and the Commission's reports. We'll have those sent out for review prior to the meeting with any suggested changes, and then we'll be looking to adopt that report, and that report then will be submitted to House leadership, to the governor's office, and to others for their review. So that'll be coming up in January. All right, at this time, I'm going to turn the clicker over to our subcommittee chair, Brian Anderson. You don't have a PowerPoint. And let him move forward. Brian, you're welcome to stay there, go to the podium, wherever you're most comfortable.
What would you prefer? I'm fine here.
That's good. Go ahead.
Well, good. Thank you, Chairman Tanner, and good afternoon to members of the commission and also our distinguished guest. I do want to provide an update from our December 4th meeting of the workforce subcommittee that we held in Macon at the Mercer University's. We're at the Athletic Field House. Let me start with thanking those that made it possible. First, Morgan Bentley from Deloitte and Patrick Zubin from Deloitte, instrumental in helping me get some things pulled together and make sure that we were on task. And also Kristen Lorehaven, who I serve with on the State Workforce Development Board. Kristen knew a lot of the right people to call on a short amount of notice and get them there so we could have the right type of testimony or comments from those in attendance. I also want to thank the subcommittee members who were able to make it, Representative Calvin Smyrie and Rhonda Briggins, who added great context and questions to our panelists. So what we did and again, Morgan and Patrick helped put together sort of what an agenda would look like to make sure we heard from the right people. And I've included that in the report to the commission. As you can see, you can tell I wrote the report rather than our consultants because it's very brief. And therefore probably not very well, but next time maybe Deloitte can put a little more meat to it. But I did try to capture what we heard, and you can see the agenda, commission members, that we had 3 panels: a higher education panel, a regional commission workforce development panel, and then a private sector employment agency panel. So again, let me thank a couple more people. Dr. Andrea Daniel, president of Athens Technical College, participated on the higher ed panel. Andrea Greiner, who serves as Vice President of Economic Development for Central Georgia Technical College, was on the higher ed panel. We also had from Regional Commission panel, we had Mr. Robert LeBeau, Director, Atlanta Regional Workforce Development Board, ARC, Carolyn Kofer, Workforce Development Director, Northeast Georgia Regional Commission, and Laura Mathis, Executive Director of Middle Georgia Regional Commission. And then last but not least, the private sector panel included Tricia Llewellyn-Conan, who's Vice President of Mission Services for Goodwill Industries of Southern Rivers, which covers about 40 counties in southwest Georgia, and then also Yvonne Williams, President of the Greater Macon Chamber of Commerce. So with that, and I do have some other copies, Chelsea, if anybody needs one, we can make sure they get those. So starting with the higher education panel, we just literally asked them a range of questions that would kind of get the context of what they see in the work they do, what's going on with workforce and education, and then specifically what they can speak to as far as transportation or transit as it relates to students. And we heard what I hear almost every day is that we do have a workforce issue, not just in any county in Georgia, but in the state of Georgia, but across the country. And the more we can do to help get young people, and even those that are retraining and changing careers, an opportunity to reach that training and reach that education, the better off we'll be. Unfortunately, what we heard was not a resounding compliment that we have a transportation network that helps students. We heard stories of students walking miles, not a mile or two, but miles to and from school. We heard stories even if they can use the bus, many times they might get to school by bus, but then it doesn't help them get to their job after class or to other needs they have, so they end up walking after that. We heard that WIOA was probably the primary support of helping make some transportation options possible, meaning that they may be a WIOA constituent already getting money for either their tuition or child care, and then in most cases we now have included transportation as an integral part of that receipt. So whether it be a bus pass, money for a bus pass, whether it be an actual per day amount to give them options for riding buses, taking an Uber, or even putting gas in a friend's car. We heard that from, again, our panelists. In the Athens area, we heard numbers like over 1,000 students receive WIOA support, and again, a part of that includes the transportation supplement. Basically, from again the higher ed mentality is that where there are larger cities and larger campuses, there is some type of transportation. In the case of Athens, there is a UGA bus system, which obviously the students use quite regularly. And actually depend on, but Athens Tech does not have its own dedicated source, and I know that the city has a system as well. And, my colleague will provide any context on that. Child care is, I guess when you listen to the stories about some of those constituents we're trying to serve, it was almost like continuous. It's money needed for tuition, money needed for child care, and money needed for transportation. They almost always go hand in hand. In the rare cases, it might be two of the three, but almost always it was one or two, more than just money needed for their education needs. Again, bus passes have been provided in the Athens area that was specifically mentioned to equal the UGA fare rates. They also made, President Daniel made an interesting comment. She said the students in the technical college system are used to they're used to a bus system. Their students are the ones that rode a bus K through 12. And so when they get out of high school and they go on to college, which is what we want, they're not shocked, but it's almost like, well, one leg of the stool is now gone, and they've got to solve for that. And so the ability to get back and forth to school, even if they know how to apply, even if they've got the means to pay for the tuition, they don't have the transportation needs in most cases. Moving on to the regional commission, and again, we can, because there was a lot of overlap. We found that instead of three separate panels, everybody wanted to jump in. So we kind of just had a round robin of, if you can answer it and add validity to the question, we were happy to hear it. So some of these may blur or blend over a little bit. So moving on to the regional commission feedback. Again, in the ARC area, the Atlanta Regional Commission area, approximately 21,000 people receive WIOA assistance. Again, they talked about the need of when they serve those constituents, not just the education money, but also to add the transportation and or child care or other wraparound services. They mentioned specifically in that particular panel that the problem with transit systems not crossing county lines, even where there are systems in place, the fact that they can't go across county lines creates issues. They made a suggestion or a comment that they believe there's not one system that's going to fix what they're looking for. We're going to have to all look at a multi-mix modes if we're going to try to make this more efficient and usable for more people. County lines should not dictate services. Another interesting point brought up by Mr. LeBeau was that when you look at Atlanta cost of living versus other cities its size or other cities that you compete against, we do pretty well in that cost of living analysis. But when you add the cost of transportation to that, there's now data showing that we're becoming uncompetitive to many of those cities that we compete against. So that was an interesting comment that I haven't heard. But when you look at cost of living analysis, let's see. Moving on to the private sector, I'm going kind of through this as a summary, but certainly want my colleagues to jump in, and certainly other commission members who may have feedback as to anything I may say or what's in the recap. Moving on to the private sector, again, we were probably hoping to hear that because there's such a workforce need, and we know there are people who do not have a dependable regular transportation, that we might hear some creative sources around employers coming to the table, and that's not what we heard. I know even in my county, I hear more complaints, and, hey, Brian, why don't you go get the city to run third shift bus routes rather than, hey, we'd love to come to the table and find a solution, but we don't have the ability to take care of our first shift, much less our second and third shift employees. In some cases, again, looking at Columbus specifically, we don't have routes that go out to where our business park locations are, and certainly don't have the second and third shift. So again, one of the comments presented by one of the, I think it might have been Ms. Williams, was that we're probably going to have to look at some type of hub-to-hub type of system and then have local connectors around that. They mentioned, again, even when there are transportation systems, they don't accommodate all needs of the employees. And I think the final one from the employee panel that I thought was exactly what we've all said, and it was a validation, is that if we're going to be successful in this conversation or as we bring about solutions, we're going to have to make transportation and economic development, workforce development priority rather than it's just a service or something that we provide because we're nice people. We've got to look at it into the economic sense. And so I'll point to you the last segment of the report that I gave you, some data points. Patrick sent this to me based on a couple of questions that were raised during the conversation. One is some U.S. Census data. It's every county's workforce commute percentage and actual users by county. It was interesting. I just pulled a few to give you kind of what I would consider the hub cities or the mid-tier cities up to Atlanta. And there really is no rhyme or reason. You know, Macon-Bibbs at a 1.1%. Savannah Chatham was at 2.7. You know, the highest users were Atlanta Fulton at 7.2, followed by Athens Clark at 4.2. So when you look at these, it just didn't, there was no correlation of size city. It was really what does the local government offer as opposed to size of city or even what I would consider the wealth of the community. And then the other is a study presented by the American Public Transportation Association that also talked about these issues. And again, the takeaway was in 2013, rural households devoted 20% of their total budget to transportation. That's 7 percentage points more than urban households. Again, that's a national study, not specific to Georgia, but it was, again, some good data points. So I guess I would sum up, and I want my colleagues to weigh in, and certainly Liz and others that have direct experience with this. I would summarize that the whole meeting was exactly what we needed to hear, specifically from a validation standpoint. We didn't hear any new news or anything that shocked any of us, but we did hear that if we're going to be successful as a state, if we're going to have the workforce we need to be competitive as we go forward, this should be one of the major priorities in addition to what we do with education. If we don't find a way to help people that we know would like to work, who are either unemployed or underemployed, if we can't solve somewhat of the transportation issue, then they're going to remain in that category, and that's going to continue to hurt not just the employees, the employers that would like to grow in our state and expand. It's also going to hurt our state in the sense that we're going to have the same constituents not able to engage into the economic success we'd like them to have. So I know it was quick, it's my nature, but I really want to get it out there for any comments from others. But again, that validation that we've got work to do, and specifically in this realm, we can make a big difference on the return on investment if we can find ways to improve. I think the other maybe final takeaway was no one feels there's one system or that we can just go do one thing, a massive, put a system across the state. But we do need to take what we have, improve it, and build upon it incrementally where we see economies of scale and where we see that return on investment possibility. With that, I'll take questions, Mr. Chairman.
Based on what you heard at your subcommittee meeting and your personal experience in workforce development and dealing with businesses, bringing businesses to Georgia and to your area in the state, you mentioned that it's difficult sometimes to get the business community to the table, even though they talk about the need for the employees. Any ideas based on what you've heard over the last 2 years, really, on this commission, what you heard at the subcommittee level, and your prior work on how to do that? How do we? Because I think you hit on something that's important. Is it's government cannot fix everything on their own. We have to have the business and the public sector's support to be able to make this happen. I think the key is how do you do that? How do you bring them to the table? Any thoughts on that?
Well, the first is, and again, if anybody here that does economic development, that's the number one criteria right now for projects. You're expected to have incentives. You're expected to have infrastructure. You're expected to have, quality of life you can offer to the company when they come. But if you can't demonstrate that the workforce is going to be there, you're delisted pretty quickly. So that's the first one I'd say. Secondly, those that I think are expanding and growing are looking at this differently. We just had a call center we recruited from Colorado that located on a bus line, sort of what you hear in Atlanta, because we could show them that their clientele, those that they're going to hire, would probably be users of public transportation, and they've been pleased because it is on one of the better routes. They've actually taken an old Winn-Dixie in a less developed part of our community and renovated it, and they're going to hire 600 people in the next year. So I think it's those that look for how to solve their problem, they're going to be more successful. Correspondingly, again, looking at Columbus proper, those that are Those companies that think they pay higher and can hire a different clientele, they're not engaged, although they'll complain, we can't get enough people. So I think we've got to find those different ways to serve different employers. I think as it continues to be a problem, employers will engage differently. As you've, again, have seen in Atlanta, it's going to trickle down to others of us. And then lastly, I would say that, if you look at, again, a community like Columbus, and I don't know how it directly correlates to Savannah or Athens or Augusta, but we've got approximately 4,000 unemployed people and approximately 3,000 open jobs. That disconnect just doesn't make sense. So it's potentially a retraining issue at worst, but how do you retrain somebody if they can't adequately and regularly afford to get to a technical college or a community college and stay? We've heard stories, again, from this panel and also those that I deal with in Columbus, that we've had students do everything right to get back in school and even be somewhat successful for a period of time, and then a life issue, the car breaks down or the friend's car breaks down, and then they're out for 3 weeks, or they just drop out completely. So I think we've all got to figure out that if you do everything right, you don't need one of these events to stop that success, because, again, 2 years of college with no completion, with no certification, is really no different than not going at all. So
One of the things that where I live, the neighboring county, Hall County, huge poultry industry there in Hall County, and several of their businesses, they have a difficult time attracting employees. They actually have purchased some buses on their own, and they run a route to pick up some employees, which has been pretty successful. I think if there's a way we can incentivize that and encourage that across the state, it could be helpful. And it also sounds like what you found at the subcommittee, same thing we've been hearing, is that we've got to find a way to get people to educational opportunities, to get their basic education, GED, and then some technical training, so then they can get that job, so they can stand on their own 2 feet and be able to afford transportation. But bridging that gap is the challenge. And like you said, we've got a lot of folks looking for employees, and a lot of employees that would, potential employees that would like to work. They just got to have the right training. So,
well, again, you look at our, specifically to Columbus, we've got one county in particular that fits what we've all heard about, what's happening to rural America, rural Georgia, is that they don't want their young people to leave. But if they have and there's no economy in that particular county, but they've got their own on-demand system. We run Metro buses all day in Columbus, but we can't get those high school graduates, 10 and 15 a year, to Columbus where the jobs are. So it may be if we can find a way to take that Columbus Metro bus outside the county to a sister county, pick up those high school graduates who have a desire to get in the Pratt & Whitney internship program or the St. Francis Hospital internship program, then we may get them that first 2 or 3 months head start. They may still continue to live in that county, which is what we want, right. But then they can get the job that they need in Columbus, where we have the job opening. So it's right there in front of us, but how we solve for it, I think it's going to take people being very creative and getting out of their traditional jurisdictional boundaries that handcuff us.
Yeah, and I think the other thing you hit on, too, that we keep seeing over and over is the issue of the county line boundaries, and the idea that we need more of a regional approach to this. And, I don't think we're interested in trying to force counties or providers to do it a certain way, but at the same time, if we can find ways to incentivize a county and a city to participate on a regional basis, all across the state, just like where you are in Columbus, you've got a region around you that feeds Columbus, both for employment, education, health care, Macon, wherever, Augusta, wherever you may be in the state. There's an urban center that's being fed by smaller rural counties. Urban center typically has some transportation options, Uber, Lyft, transit services, but you get out into these rural parts of the state, we don't. And we've heard a lot about rural Georgia through our rural council that's been working in the House for the last 2 years also alongside us. We heard Governor-elect talk a lot about rural Georgia. So transportation is a huge part of that, and being able to get them, if you live in Glasscock County over near Augusta, there's just not a whole lot of opportunities in Glasscock County for employment. You've got to go to Augusta. But if you've got transit services there, if they're stopping at the county line, that's not doing you a whole lot of good. So I think being able to find ways to incentivize a regional approach, being able to find ways to incentivize businesses to help participate in the transportation solution is key. And then also maybe even looking for ways to provide people with a short-term assistance for transportation to school and to work. May also be helpful, and we'll talk more about that even this afternoon. So, all right.
Calvin, you want to add anything that I missed or did represent you well?
You did a great job. I just want to add that in the meeting in Macon, and hearing all of the testimony that they gave us, seeing transit as an economic development tool and a workforce development priority, it really raises the bar. I think that if you try to do it as a service, it's just we kind of got the feeling that it was not going to work. It has to be defined as workforce development and economic development. Then the issue sort of elevates itself if we can get the county governments, because the difficult part is the county lines and the politics with crossing county lines. Those of y'all who've been around here a minute or two in the General Assembly, we lost the banking industry because of county lines. We defied the politics of the day, and therefore Georgia lost the banking industry to North Carolina because of everybody wanted to keep their own kingdom in their own county as it relates to financial development and banking. And that's why Georgia is not the banking industry of the Southeast. So when you think about issues of this nature, then workforce development and economic development, it has to be defined in this way, because trying to get what was the lady? It was a lady that they gave us an example of. She getting up in the morning, taking her child, first of all, to catch the bus to go to school, and then she had to get away to catch the bus to get to her job. Now, you're not going to get a service. The government's not going to provide a service for that. But if you can couch it in economic development and the corporations such as the Pratt Whitneys of the world and all of those corporations, if you can find a way to create a service and replicate what we're doing in the ATL, that the counties have some sort of collaborative, and those counties that are contiguous, you start with that, because I'm thinking about Macon, Georgia, or that's surrounded by a lot of counties. And all the jobs are in Macon. So if you can get all of those counties that are contiguous to get some kind of service, collaborative service to take people to work in to Bibb County, I think it kind of elevates. So we learned a lesson from T-SPLOST, y'all who remember T-SPLOST, trying to get the counties together, but they didn't want to get together because they saw this competition. Well, now you're gonna get more than I'm getting a quarter, and you're gonna get a dime. But when we brought the ATL piece, everybody see it as economic development. Everybody gains, and therefore we had to go through a failure in T-SPLOST, so to speak, and now look where we are in ATL. So the county is all giving up. The region is going to gain, and if we could kind of replicate that fundamental and our mental capacity and be innovative and replicate what we're doing here in this area around the state and the counties that the second tier counties, I call them, the Columbus, the Macons, the Savannahs, the Augustas, and have a feeder system and have some collaboration. I think we got a hold of something, because these counties they need help, and it goes to the Rural Development Council and what they're trying to do. And we kind of parallel with them, and hopefully some of our recommendations will go into what the RDC is doing, because I just think there's an opportunity here for us to do something in our rural counties and trying to assist them and through a workforce development initiative and come up with something. And that's what my vision is, to see the kind of do something and replicate what we're doing here in the metro area and try to replicate it in those pockets around the state. And hopefully we can assist people in getting the jobs, and then have the various chambers of commerce play a role, and the economic development authorities play a role, so that it can be beneficial to the county and to the counties, both county to county. So I'm hoping that we can get a lot of county commissioners together and throw these ideas out and try to get them to see that having a bus service that goes across county lines would be beneficial to the entire region.
Thank you. And, you know, a lot of it comes down to return on investment. And, you know, you hit on that with the economic development conversation, is the fact that we can show that by investing in this transportation service, we're able to get more people employed. In turn, they pay more in state income tax, which brings more money into the coffers of the state, also gets them off of other governmental subsidies, which is just a good return on our investment. So, Commissioner Hausman.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the comprehensive look that you've done here with not only the economic development piece and getting folks to their places of work, but the training of the workers for these businesses, because economic development will not be successful if the businesses cannot have a qualified workforce. And I think that to have a conversation that included Metro Atlanta, the ARC, as we go and expand throughout the state in a meaningful way, is very crucial to the success of any expansion and any efforts to provide transit in the other parts of the state, but not only from things that we've done well, but from things that we have missed the boat on. And I think that if you look at the ridership numbers, while they look impressive in Fulton and Atlanta and DeKalb County, who's had a robust transit system for 40 plus years, we could be doing better than that if the system went where it needed to go and was affordable. So I think that that's a very telling story in and of itself, that we've got 7.2 in Fulton County. We should have 15% in Fulton County as a regular basis. So I think that's something we all should pay attention to. I think that as we expand even in the MARTA area, in the ATL area, that we need to focus on the areas where folks can get educated. As we locate stations and bus stops and routes, to make sure that we are providing access to those institutions of higher learning so that we can continue to grow even in the metro. And I would hope that, that would be one of the highest priorities of any system that is provided. The county line issue is interesting as we embark on the ATL here in Atlanta. I think that we have, at the local level, recognize that nobody really knows those boundaries except those that govern them. And it is very important, of course, the revenue that is generated by the citizens of a certain jurisdiction, and that their needs are taken into consideration because they are paying. But the average person does not know if they're in Fulton or DeKalb County when they're moving around town or going to work or shopping or wherever they're going, their houses of worship. So I think that we have to look at where people need to go, why they need to go there, and take that as one of the major considerations for any system that's developed. So I'm glad to see that.
Thank you. You know, as we were having the conversation about the ATL and how to set up the districts, that's one of the things we talked about, is the fact that we didn't want to just make them encompassing just in county lines. But one of the other things you mentioned that we've heard over and over throughout the last specifically year has been a lot of times the county may have a transit service, but either it doesn't go where the employees are actually located or to the actual jobs, or it doesn't run at the time that it needs to run for someone to actually be able to use it. If it's just a 9 to 3 program, it's not helping a whole lot of folks. So we've got to, it has to go where it's needed, and it has to run during the times that people need to use it.
Mr. Chairman, you're exactly right, and as a model for how to work with an employer and a system is the recent UPS facility that opened out at Charlie Brown Airport. They have unique times that their employees need to get to work, not the typical time that a transit system may operate. But our local MARTA system met with them and worked with the time needs of their shifts and when the employees needed to be there, which were, again, not typical times, sometimes 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, in order to serve that community and allow the almost 2,500 folks that had now gotten jobs at that facility to get to work.
Representative Aller.
I have a young friend that just started at the UPS Center. He starts at 4 a.m., which helps him get home to do all his children's things right after school. It fits his family well. I'm interested that DeKalb County is 7.9, the highest of any of the counties of public transportation, but I'm also aware of the poultry industry buses that come into our refugee and international community around Charleston and take workers. I don't know what the starting salary is at a poultry plant or a call center. It may be less than $10 an hour, though. The economic development argument really rings true to me, because if you have a workforce need for an $8 or $9 or $10 an hour employee, you're going to have to provide. You're going to have to provide some transit services as part of your employment package. Even in a county that's 7.9 uses public transit more than any, even our county is still the industry, the poultry industry needs to come to DeKalb County and pick up workers to take to some poultry plant in Hall or Rockdale or Newton.
Yeah. Director Thomason.
It's really a good segue from Representative Oliver's comments. The cost component for people in these jobs is a critical component to look at. And I think it does speak to the fact that working with the private sector will be key. There's a frequency problem in terms of the availability of service, how often it runs, and so better coordination. But at these salary levels, whatever the cost of the service is representing such a higher percentage of their out-of-pocket expenses that if there are ways to work with the private sector to either subsidize those costs or do anything like that, it'll help. For many of us who have transit operations, the cost of running the service, relatively speaking, is I shouldn't say fixed, but predictable. We know on a per hour of service what it costs to operate that bus, regardless of how many people are in it. So at least with being able to project some of those costs, we can have some pretty interesting discussions about either incentives or what can be done to look at the cost of fares, because there's still even a perception issue with transit. So part of it is even getting people to try transit as well as coordinate the service hours. But there's something just about getting over the initial cost of paying for it. And unfortunately, we even see riders who, while they would want the discounts associated with, say, a monthly pass, having that lump sum available at one time isn't something they have, so they end up paying when they can identify the funds what might be a higher single fare amount, even though they really need the discounts of the monthly product, but it represents such a large portion up front. So there's just a number of issues that I'm hoping over time we can find some better strategies to just make it easier to even access the transit, because I think these numbers, it's a vicious cycle. The numbers are low because people aren't utilizing it. People aren't utilizing it, so we don't want to invest more in it, let alone the common issues that go for Metro Atlanta as well as the rest of the state. Is it actually connecting to the places they want to go? And then you come back to, well, should I invest in it to expand it when such a low percentage is using it? So these issues are just circular in nature, and hopefully we can come with some strategies to break out of that cycle.
Thank you. Curtis, 26.
Exactly.
Oh, you do what?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Brian, for your work on the subcommittee on this. And I think this does actually show that need and how economic development is driven by public transportation and by different modes of public transportation. We know what happens here in the metro area, and we see a lot of big buses and things like that. One thing that we have to remember that there are various modes of public transportation outside of a 40-foot bus or a commuter bus. You can have coordinated van services. You can have coordinated carpool services that all can be managed under the guidance of a public transit system. And we show this example here in Athens. You know, if 4.2% are using public transportation to get to work, you know, and to get to school, and we have, you know, two big modes here. We have, in Athens, we have a great relationship with the University of Georgia. They contract with us to provide their services, and it's on a per-trip basis, and they pay us for that. Athens Tech does not have that opportunity, and of course, UGA has their own campus transit system. Athens Tech happens to be on the peripheral of our community. It's at the end of the line of one of our transit lines, and it's actually a very busy transit line because of the student population that rides it. But the way we're set up, we're not able to reach out further and get outside of those county lines. And that brings back the point that where we're having the struggles outside of the metro area with a small urbanized area that has nothing but rural communities around it, or rural counties, I should say. Those rural counties are struggling with ways to pay for grading roads and paving roads and things like that. They don't have additional funding to pay for transit as they see it today. And that's why I think we have to help them educate and help them find some other means of funding public transportation outside of their property taxes, which we're dealing with now. An example would be Madison County, which is right just to the northeast of Athens. Their entire county budget is $13 million a year for the whole county. And so to come up with money to help pay for some transit as well, they've got to do something about it. You know, they need another means of generating revenue to do so. So they can help get these folks from Madison County or Elbert County. And there's actually an Athens Tech campus in Elbert County also, and I've spoke with them, and they've asked us to bring buses to them. Love to, but I've got to get the county commissioners in those other counties to help participate in the overall cost of that, or to get the community, the industry, the college, or someone else to help pay for the overall cost of what's going to do that. You don't have to have a 40-foot bus doing this. You can do it with an 8 or a 10 or 15 passenger van and still cover quite a bit of ground. Actually, much more economical, as Chris was saying. We know what the cost per hour is. It's a lot less to run a van than it is to run a 40-foot bus. But we have to have a mechanism to reach out to these folks and show this is the reason for adding another tax or adding another fee or something like that to help pay for this over top, because they're already struggling already. But if we can get these folks from the rural areas into these small urban areas outside the metro area, get them into the schools, get them educated, they're going to go out and become productive people. They're going to start earning money, making money, and spending money. And then, of course, they're paying taxes when they're doing so. So this just shows that, you know, if you've got a service there, they'll use it. And if we can get the other folks together to help them, having an hour-and-a-half trip for someone to take their child to daycare and then get to work and then have to turn around and do that on the backside of the day, or doing it at very strange hours, you know, shift work is shift work, and that's what these folks are going to be doing. We talked with our representatives from Caterpillar. They wanted us to, you know, basically bring a bus from downtown Athens to CAT. We surveyed their employees and figured out, well, you got about 160 employees out of 1,500 that live in Athens, Clark County, and they're in 4 different zip codes. Most of them came from the 7 counties around us, but we didn't have a coordinated transit service to do so. We've got to be able to get our small regions to work together. Whether we have a single county transit SPLOS or we have a regional transit SPLOS or something like that, the education process has to come to play. And if we give some folks the opportunity to start building upon that, I think others will tag on, and it'll help make the regionals become a reality. But it's going to have to start with baby steps, 1 or 2 counties at a time, and so that we can make things better for everybody.
But you answered part of my question. I was going to ask you how many counties typically fed Athens, and you said around 7.
Around 7.
Out of those 7, do they all have some type of dial-a-bus or transit service?
They have none. Actually, out of those 7, Jackson County's got a small service that runs 2 vans. Elbert County's got a service that runs 2 or 3 vans. Outside of that, there are no other transit services. If you look at some of those maps that we saw in some of our other presentations, we're kind of the island out there with a lot of white around us. And there was a color that was on the map that showed no transit services were available besides Jackson County and Elbert County, and those are part of the ones that feed us. But yeah, we're just not getting out to those counties, and those counties again, they're struggling grading roads and keeping dirt roads gravel on them, so they don't have any other means of paying for some other fund of transit. And so that's why I think we need to think about offering an opportunity to go with a single county transit SPLOST, and then let people build from there and let these regions start building. Because again, people don't care where the county line is. If they want to go to the Walmart that's 2 miles on the other side of the county line, that's where they want to go to. And they don't care for what county it is. But when you talk to a county commissioner, we had our transit study that we did last year, and we had a huge population wanted to go to the Walmart in Oconee County. I like my friends in Oconee County, but you know what they've told us? We're not interested in transit today. It may be they're in the same boat that Gwinnett is 20 years from now, but we have to start somewhere.
All right, thank you. I was talking to Commissioner McMurray the other day. We were having a conversation about regional transit and trying to find ways to encourage that across the state. And he had a couple ideas, and I asked him if he would mention those. I hate to put him on the spot, but what number are you, Commissioner, down there? Commissioner, talk a little bit about the idea of incentivizing that and how we might incentivize some regional transit cooperation.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thanks for the conversation. I'm going to add on to what Butch was just talking about and some of what Dean Smyrie talked about, as well as start with this. I keep hearing the word region all through all the speakers this morning, and regional approach, and indeed I believe we've all come to that consensus that that's sort of the approach. But I just looked at the numbers around Athens, Clark counties. I'm not going to name the counties, but it's 0.1, 0.2, 0.3 that are immediately adjacent. And the difference is what Butch just said, is there's no participation at the county level. So one of the things we heard from T-SPLOST and the TIA as the 3 original regions that passed, and now the 4th one, was exactly what Brian knows and what Dean Smyrie talked about, is I just want my penny to stay in my county. But I think with the success of the 3 regions we've seen thus far, and obviously the 4th one coming on board this year, that people understand that the rising tide lifts all ships, and there's a different conversation out of those 3 regions today than there was back before the referendum passed. And everybody sees that there's a benefit, a mutual benefit, from going as things as a region. So I'll tell you, and Carol Comer sitting here in the office over our intermodal, and our staff has worked hard to try to get the 5311 program in all 159 states. It's not for the absence of trying. It goes back to what Butch talked about when the county commission just says we don't have the money. So if we do a regional approach, there's still you still got to overcome how do you bring the matching funds no matter which federal program you're going to participate in. And the federal money is there. Well, let's not talk about that at the moment, but ultimately it'll be there. Is how do you get people to the table? And in the T-SPLOST discussions prior to those referendums, it was obviously more revenue, but there were some interesting parts of that. There was a less match on roads and bridges kind of thing that really incentivized cities and counties to say, hey, we would have less match at the state level if we pass some referendum. So part of my conversation with Chairman was how do we incentivize, how do we go about incentivizing the counties that have a difficult time now stepping to the plate and making it happen, and also the counties and municipalities that don't participate. And it's got to be some additional funding somehow. And even if, everywhere you go in transportation funding, it's all about match and leverage. That's the word of the year at the federal level, is how do you leverage? And we look at that at the state level as well. So, what is the percentage that potentially the state could put forth to help leverage the local, or vice versa? It depends on what chair you sit in. So I really think that's the conversation that, has to be had, is what dollars at what level helps encourage people to come to the table, because it does tie back to a great economic development story that we've all of you around the table has talked about thus far this morning. So I think, you know, when you can start putting those things in place, and again, maybe there are other incentives to business and industry, like some of the conversations we had between leveraging those kind of things, leveraging some kind of way to incentivize some participation, then you get counties together, because somehow we have to get them together in some regional boundary, whatever that may be. I mean, I know I saw the report from the last meeting, and you know, there's some notions around that. So I think we have to think that way. But at some point, you still have to draw a boundary, and then what's been articulated this morning, even when you draw those boundaries for those purposes, you still have to figure out how to get across that imaginary line. If there's a job center, education center, healthcare center, whatever, that still makes sense. And I think, again, through mutual agreements and understanding, MOAs, MOUs, operating agreements, those things can be overcome. In 5311, there's the ability to overcome those today. It takes a little work and it takes cooperation, but I think if we can sort of, again, step back, talk about the economic development part of that, get it applied to some regional boundary, you know, determination, and then bring the carrot instead of the stick, and because that's the challenge. And when you look, this is great data. When I start looking at those that participate at the regional level too, and I hadn't done this thoroughly, so don't fact check me or put the truthometer on it, but it looks like the regional approach has a little higher participation percentages than the ones that don't. So I think that begins to tell the tale. I'd like to personally draw out the boundaries and see how those stack up. But Mr. Chairman, that's just, again, some thoughts that we've had inside the department is, again, you know, when you look at how do you get it delivered, there's got to be some kind of incentive to help bring those along. Ones that I think the ones obviously in the regional commission's boundaries that have passed a T-Splost obviously have some operating dollars. I remind everybody, those dollars are perfectly allowable for transit purposes, operations, and maintenance, which is a beautiful thing. So those 4 regions, which cover, I can't do the math off the top of my head, how many counties, that covers a lot of bandwidth of counties that have some dollars that they could invest. And again, the state could bring some level. And then for those other counties that are on the bubble that said, you know, we would if we could, that really puts a little bit of a emphasis on, well, maybe that's the tipping point. And then as a region goes, you know, again, you got to try to see how everybody can sort of lift the region collectively. And, you know, equity is important, no doubt, but it may be on the basis of ability as well somehow. You know, some kind of look at each county's and municipalities' ability to provide revenue on some percentage. You know, because a dollar is a dollar, but depends on what you have in your bank account when you start. So anyway, comments. Welcome any comments or suggestions.
Thank you, Commissioner. I believe Commissioner Hausman.
Yes, I just wanted to talk a minute about the incentive piece of this for the local counties. Commissioner Ott and I looked at each other on the $13 million operating budget, you know, and can't imagine what that must be like. You know, yes, we have a lot more services we have to provide for a larger population, but that has got to be extremely challenging. And so if you're in one of those communities that is, say, on the bubble of a city that has an employment center, an educational center, but your folks can't access it in an affordable way, I think that there's a potential for an analysis, the return on investment analysis, to be given to those communities to show the benefits for that investment over the long term and allowing folks to still live in those communities versus moving away. And then they totally lose any revenue from those people, and their communities slowly continue to not prosper. So I think that there's a way to present it to these communities where they can understand that this investment would actually reap a lot of benefits to their communities. But the real thing, in my opinion, is that the state has to come to the table with some investments. And whether that's initially more than it would be, say, 10 years from now, once the service has been there and the benefits have been realized, I think that it's important not only in the metro area for the state to participate, but we have to figure out a way to put some real money into whatever we recommend, because without that financial support, it's just another report that's going to go up on a shelf, and we can all pat ourselves on the back that we really tried to do something, but if we don't fund it, it's pretty meaningless. And I know that, the state did come to the table this year with the first round. I mean, the metro area, the ATL, is also, I think, in need of that support. So I hope that whatever recommendations come forward from this body do include some funding sources that are consistent and dedicated and long-term, because otherwise we've done a great job of analysis but without any real solutions.
Thank you. And I think you hit on something, and Commissioner McMurray said this too, is there's not a silver bullet. I don't think we recognize one issue is we need to have more of a regional approach to transit, not only in metro but all across the state, around these other urban centers. So some way the state can incentivize communities to want to participate regionally, and the state help financially incentivize them. Find a way to bring employers to the table to help get new employees to work, and maybe incentivize that, and then also find a way to get people who are not currently employable because of their educational level to educational opportunities, and ultimately to that first job is important. And all of those could have a positive return on investment. And then Commissioner Hausman, I think, hit on it too, is we have to have folks that are able to sell that, to be able to show clearly why a county next to Athens should participate in that program, that this is not just you spending money that you may not have. This is actually, there's a clear plan. You do this, here's your return, it's been shown to work, and here's the benefit it's going to be to your community. So I think it's, like you said, no silver bullet, but there's a lot of opportunities that we have. Mr. Anderson.
One more quick thing that I thought of as these guys were talking is that what I heard back at our last meeting about the regional mobility manager that we talked about, it would be the person that's going to handle the region, is providing some expertise or accountability, because there are places that maybe we have a system, but it's not being led by the right people, or the right system. So we put it in place, we get the federal dollars, we've got something, so we have it, but maybe there's not enough incentives or creativity around how to make it work. I mean, what would incentivize Columbus to go try to reach out to its counties? Now, I see the point, because I hear from the other counties they're basically telling us, we'll do whatever it takes. Our citizens need jobs. Our citizens want to prosper, but we can't if they just stay right here in our rural counties. So I shouldn't be the only one having to think, how do we run a bus to those counties? It ought to be the system that's already in place. I think that manager might be able to help bring some expertise and accountability across the system. Right now, I think you'd find every system is a little different.
No, I think that's a very valid point. Number 27. Okay, Chairman Taylor.
So, as a metro guy who uses MARTA pretty much every day, you also have to manage expectations. Not heavy rail is not going to go everywhere in the state. There's an expectation, oh, we're going to have a train going here or heavy rail going there. It's very expensive. I think the flexibility of vans, buses, short buses, whatever you want to call them, to adapt to changing workforces and everything are a lot more flexible. But I think you need to manage those expectations, because there's a lot of folks that think, oh, we're in MARTA now, we're going to get heavy rail to Athens or wherever. The other things are, and my personal observations are basically on time, safe, clean is what people expect. And you've got to really look at that, because there's still a perception of public transportation is it's dangerous, and it really is not, but you got to change that perception. My 2 cents.
Thank you. Yeah, and I think when you get outside Metro Atlanta, and as a guy from rural Georgia, people don't see the necessity of transit. We've been tied to our vehicles, our cars. They don't see the necessity. So I think you hit on something. You know, having someone that has that specific expertise for that specific region, where they understand their region, they understand their communities, because we're a very diverse state in a lot of different ways, and depending on if you're in Southwest Georgia, Southeast Georgia, Northeast Georgia, Northwest Georgia, we're similar, but we also are different. And having a mobility manager that understands their area, I think, is important, because they're able to get those relationships with their county commissioners and their city councils and their mayors and their regional commissions to be able to start building those relationships and selling the way this can be a positive return, and that's going to be important. But you 26.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And thank you, sir. And actually, I just wanted to, something struck me while we were talking about incentives, and maybe I can help some folks to remember, and I think I remember this correctly. Remember when Greta started, how we were, the incentive we got from the feds to start running express buses in the metro area? The feds paid for it for the first 3 years in each region, and then we saw the benefits, and then we started having to pay for it ourselves. So I think, if I remember that correctly, and Chris or Commissioner, I think that was how it started when we started Greta back. It was 2000, 2002, somewhere in that time frame. That was the carrot that we were given by the feds, that they would fund it up front for several years, and then we took over afterwards. Is that not correct?
What number are you? Okay. Go ahead.
When Greta was started, it was sort of a two-prong approach. But what Butch is talking about is there are certain federal funds, we call them CMAQ funds, Congestion Mitigation Air Quality Funds. Those funds, and those are still available today for it's like anything that's federal. There's a bunch of specific requirements. But assuming you can check all those boxes, up to 80% of the operational costs for new service for up to 3 or 4 years, depending on, again, some other things, but typically for 3 years, can be paid for with these federal funds. After that time period, though, a non-federal source has to be identified. So on that point, that's, again, one of these sort of circular things. There may be some funds to get started, but what is going to replace that when those federal funds are no longer available? It's one of many cliffs that we talk about in transit. The second thing that was done when Greta was first started was there was a mix of funding where the state looked at providing additional capital dollars on a ratio basis if the local entity would find ongoing operational dollars for every dollar that they could find in ongoing operational funds. There was, I don't want to misstate, so I'm not going to state a number, but there was a higher number of capital dollars that were put up. So those were one-time funds in exchange for the ongoing operation money over a certain length of time. But that had the dual purpose of a shot in the arm to get the assets needed to start the service, but a direct recognition that there's going to have to be an ongoing local commitment for the operational dollars. But it was a combination of those two, then adding, to ease the pain of this new commitment, there was this federal program that could ease the operational costs for the first 3 years. So.
Mm-hmm.
I'm looking at the commissioner. I mean, we spend a lot of time looking at these federal funds, and I don't know if there's anything you want to add.
Go ahead. Thank you.
No, Director Tomlinson hit the nail on the head. That's the way that was stood up. But to Butch, to your point, there was an incentive, and part of the capital projects, not the capital expense of the express, were working on arterials, because this stems back to air quality issues where Georgia was in a non-attainment area at that point. So part of that was to leverage, again, capital construction projects to these major arterials around the region. And it was, again, I always sort of called it buses for projects. That's probably a gross oversimplification of it, but that's sort of how it worked. But that it was all in the effort of air quality and mobility, which was very important at the time. But it went back to your point, was that's what got counties to the table to start talking about regional express at the time, and obviously Greta being stood up really for one of the major purposes, which still stands as the air quality component of that. So that's how that came to be.
You know, another thing that I think commissioners hit on, Chris has hit on, Liz has hit on, Butch hit on, is the fact that if we're going to incentivize, if we're going to do these things, we have to have funding. And I think it's important to have dedicated funding sources, so that that's something that we know is ongoing year after year after year, that we're going to use these funds for these purposes. Because if not, everything might work for a short period of time, but in the long term, we're always going to be worried about where the dollars are going to come from. So I think as we're looking, and as we talk about recommendations even this afternoon, we've got to be able to identify dedicated funding sources to be able to fund these items, because I think we can show a positive return on the investment, but the seed money has to be there, and it has to be ongoing. All right. Well, this is a great discussion. I appreciate Brian. Appreciate your subcommittee's work and all the people who attended, and thank you to just everyone that was participating in that discussion. Next, we have private sector perspective on transit, Southern Point staffing. If you would just come up to the podium, and we will, let me see. All right, just introduce yourself, and we'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much. My name is Brewer Turley. I'm with Southern Point Staffing. I'm here with Jason and Brianna Wilson. They own the company. I really appreciate you guys having us, to come give our input on this, and really God bless you guys for your consideration and your study of these issues. When it comes to workforce development, when it comes to getting people to work, there is no bigger issue in our area than transportation. I wanted to start out just giving you kind of a snapshot of our company and what we do. We were established in 2013. We're a relatively young company. We've got 30 business clients in the Albany area, everything from construction to upper level administrative jobs. Some of our positions are entry level, $8 an hour. A lot of them, they're looking for really skilled workers. So we kind of run the gamut in terms of what kind of employees that we're looking for. 250 employees that work through us on a temporary to permanent basis. Most of our employees go full-time with the companies that we hire them for, and you see a $4.7 million in annual payroll. By no means, we're not the largest staffing company in the world. I don't think we're even the biggest one in Albany, but to us, these people just mean the world to us. Anything we could do to help get these people to work is a worthy endeavor. We're looking at things that just people have no control over, getting to work. They have no hope, no opportunities. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit today is just how do we get them to work. I wanted to give you kind of a snapshot of where our work sites are. We've got home remodeling and these are central from Albany Courthouse. Just to give you an idea of how far people are traveling to work for us. 1.9 miles home remodeling. We've got a warehouse that's about 4 miles. Construction site, we've got about 5 miles. Manufacturing, warehousing, pecan production, relatively small distances when you consider kind of what, the area of Albany. We've also got additional work sites in Newton, Sylvester, those are about 20 miles away. Americus, a little bit further, 38 miles, Vienna, and Thomasville, we go out about 60 miles. And these are the areas where we're having the most problems because they might as well, people can't get to work in Albany. We surely can't get them to go to Thomasville. So that's kind of an outline of our clients. I wanted to give you a little bit larger snapshot of the large employers in our area. These aren't our clients. This simply gives you a look at the largest employers and kind of where Albany people are going to work. Keystone Foods, a little over 1,800. Tyson Foods in Vienna, 1,700. Sanderson Farms, 1,500. These are chicken manufacturing plants. Procter & Gamble, M&M Mars, 700 and 400. Coates and Clark Yarn Manufacturers, 356, Webster-Runt, 330, and Thrush Aircraft, 280, Lineage, Sunnyland Farms, 220 and 160, and then Birdsong, relatively smaller number, 60. And then finally, I want to give you just the average numbers of miles. If you're traveling from Albany to one of these employers, this is how many miles you're going a week. 280 for Keystone and Camilla. Tyson Foods in Vienna, you're traveling 510 miles per week. Sanderson Farms and Moultrie, about 450. Birdsong Peanuts, 230. And then 79 for Procter & Gamble there in Albany. And then these are just the local routes there in Albany. So people are, from our community, making it to work at these places, no matter the distance, no matter what it takes to kind of get there. It could be 35 miles or 450 miles per week. They are making the effort to kind of get to work. But they could use some help in these areas. If we have solutions for the rural transportation issues, would mean potential for remarkable growth in our area. And I don't mean growth of our company or our fiscal situation. I simply mean just the number of people that we can put to work if we find some issues, some solutions to the issues in our area. Qualified candidates would get access to better paying jobs. Client companies would benefit from a new talent pool. Perhaps they haven't looked in another city for the people that they're looking for, and they could find a whole new qualified work base. Communities would see an increase in out-of-town spending, restaurants, convenience stores, and then for us, it would mean just a better culture, a better economic outlook for our area. To Albany people, small opportunities are still opportunities. If you give the slightest opportunity to some of the people that I've interviewed, that I've worked with, it pays off. In addition to being a communications person for our business, I'm a recruiter. So day-to-day interactions, I've seen the issues that people are dealing with transportation. The first and the biggest one is just the poverty we have in our area. It's generational. People have given up the idea that they're supposed to own a house, they're supposed to own a car, they're supposed to have things that they see on TV. They've given that idea up totally. If you think of the traditional way you get your first vehicle, mom and dad get a new one. They have, better access. Their jobs get better. They can buy a new vehicle. They can afford that. They pass their vehicle down to you. In Albany, what I've found in most cases is single-car families, sometimes 2 and 3 generations, are sharing the same vehicle. And whoever's got the best job, whoever's the breadwinner, they get the vehicle. They get the lion's share of how that vehicle is used. Everybody else in that family, they have to kind of make, they have to schedule accordingly, take a night shift position. So they're not going after the best jobs they can get. They're taking what they can get because their transportation is limited. Bus schedules, we've got a great bus system in Albany, but it's just not meeting the needs of what I've seen the employers need in terms of shifts, in terms of locations. So many of our job seekers are, as I've mentioned, just taking the job that they can get. Proximity is a key factor. Many people know that they can't get to work, so they're just going to pick the place closest to them and just wait on an opening to come along there, no matter the pay, no matter what their skills are. They're limiting themselves severely because of lack of transportation. A lot of our people are dependent on friends or neighbors for rides, and they don't often share the motivation to get to work. I mean, I'm sure their neighbors and their cousins or brothers love them, but they don't love them enough to get them there on time. They're not going to let them down. I got your ride to work. Whether we get there on time, I can't really do much more than that. And then finally, the frustration over lack of transportation. I've seen it, and it's rough. We've got guys that fully qualified for these jobs. They can get to work. I mean, they can go in, top marks in every column in terms of doing the job. Hardest worker I've got. They finish on time. They do twice as much work as the other guy. But I've still got to go in and have conversations about being late, being absent because your car broke down, or your neighbor didn't get up in time to take you to work, and it's frustrating for both them and for us. So just knowing that we've got guys that can do the job, they just can't get there, it's a problem that we're looking at fixing. Albany Transit, again, it's a great system, but we need to find ways to kind of supplement that. These are just a few of the observations we've seen just from our clients. You know, most bus schedules do not coincide with shift changes. If somebody's got a 3 a.m. shift, they're not going to be able to make it relying on the bus. Some employees have taken to, you know, get into work early, several hours. If their shift starts in the evening, they've got to catch that 6 o'clock bus to get there. If their shift starts at 6, they're just standing outside waiting or in break rooms, and it's just not a good situation. And then, of course, many of our employers are beyond the bounds of city bus transportation, so there's no, you know, just no way of getting there if they're dependent on the bus. And just for a footnote, we've got about 7 or 8 Uber drivers in Albany. It hadn't really caught on there yet, so you know, that's out as an option. So our workforce, just to give you guys a perspective, transportation is not, you know, it's not keeping our guys from going out there and getting it. Dedicated, resilient, and determined to make the most of any opportunity to provide for themselves and their families. I wanted to humanize this issue a little bit. I could have brought 20 or 30 different stories, but this guy's, this is, you know, Larry Butler. His story is special to me because it kind of opened my eyes to what the issues were. It was a Thursday or Friday. We had a quick turnaround on a warehouse job we had to do, and he was the candidate. You know, I called him about 8 o'clock in the morning. I said, hey, can you be here? You know, 9 o'clock, let's go ahead and do your new hire paperwork, get you started Monday. Oh, yeah, no problem, I'll be there. 10 o'clock come around, 11 o'clock came around, and he didn't show. And so I had gone on to another candidate, and he called back. He said, man, I'm having a little trouble getting a ride there. You know, can you wait till this afternoon? And I was like, sorry, man, got to find another one. That was my attitude towards it at that point. So the candidate, I also found, the backup candidate fell through, so I had to go back to Larry. And I said, can you be here at 2 o'clock? He said, yeah, I could be there at 2 o'clock and everything. 2 o'clock rolls around, he's still not there. I called him back at 3, and I said, man, what's going on? Are you worried about the drug test? Are you ducking me for some reason? He said, I feel like the whole world has turned their back on me today. And he said, if I could get there, he said, I'd have been there by now. He said, the client itself, he said, I could walk there, no problem. It's a mile from the house. But as far as your office, it might as well be Siberia. I can't get there. I said, well, I'll come pick you up. You know, so I can't do that for every one of our employees. But this guy's special to me. You know, and he's there to this day. We hired him in June. He works in a cold storage warehouse. He walks to work sometimes. He gets, you know, but he's, you know, he's indicative of what we've got in Albany. Give him the slightest little chance to get to work, and we're going, you know. So, our plan, and this is not facts and figures, this is just us discussing kind of what we would like to see our company do, and let's just build a transit company that provides reliable, affordable transportation for the workforce serving our area's biggest communities, companies. Vans is what we're looking at. Not a huge bus system that can provide mass transportation. We simply want to look at getting 10, 15, 20 people to work at a time. So our plan, just what we've hashed out so far, dedicated routes will be established for companies of 30 or more employees to start with. Once we get that established and once we can get some routes going, we'll be able to serve smaller you know, employers in our area and serve more people. But for now, the target's 30. They've got to be large employers to get the dedicated routes rolling. Routes would be tailored to whatever the employer needs. There wouldn't be a, you know, at 8, 9, 10, there wouldn't be bus pickups like that. It would be based on if you work at Keystone or if you work at Lineage and you're on the 3 o'clock shift, you'd be here at 2:30 and we'll give you a ride to work, we'll pick you up at the end of the day. Services are for workforce transportation only. I realize there are issues that face the elderly in education, but for right now we need to be focused on workforce first and then maybe move on to some other issues. We've got 2 different you know, ideas about funding it, either a flat rate fee for the employee or asking the employer that uses the service to you know, provide that cost. We would you know, we'd have to examine which one's more feasible, but you know, either one I think would be a good business model to start out with. Central pickup, drop-off locations established in surrounding communities. Started off in Albany, and then we can go to the outlying areas in Dawson, Camilla, Sasser, Lee County, and just see if we could branch it out. And we're not just providing this service for our clients. It would be anybody that sees the need. At this point, we wouldn't be just after our own, our own clients or our own employees. It would be a separate company apart from what we do at Southern Point Staffing. Another issue is just we want to be more proactive in supplying the information that lenders need for 6-month verification of employment. That needs to be something that it's not a hassle to us to provide, but it should be something that we're providing to every employee without even them having to ask. It should be something that we're educating them on. If they're having credit problems or haven't established credit yet, to buy vehicles or something like that. Our needs at this point, just input, best practices. I saw earlier in one of the presentations where there's already a best practices document that we might get our hands on and kind of look how other companies are doing this. Tax incentives for the creation of it, and then tax incentives for the people using the service would be great. But just I saw Mr. Tanner had something in the AJC about he wants to see innovation and competition. And to tell you the truth, I mean I'm not sure if we really want to be the first people to get to this issue, but we're going to give it a shot, and hopefully it catches on. But we would love to see kind of a blueprint of how this is done in other communities, not just for transportation, but for transportation as a second company outside of the normal operations. So that's all the information I had. If anybody needs to get in touch with either me or Brianna Wilson or Jason Wilson for more information, we'd be happy to talk to you guys. Thank y'all very much.
I just as you were talking, I was thinking about everything you were saying is exactly the reason that we're here, is to be able to find ways to get the gentleman like you spoke to who wants to work but really has no current options available to him to a job so that he can better himself and move himself out of generational poverty. And that's the reason we're actually having this conversation. The other thing I thought about too is why we talked about innovation, and you hit on that, and that's something we use that term quite a bit. But just your company and thinking about your own community, your own issues, seeing the challenges that people face who want to get to jobs, and being able to be creative and coming up with ideas. And that's what we, I think, need to foster as a state and encourage that innovation so that and help pay for that innovation, quite frankly, so that we're able to have folks like you who are on the ground that understand it better than anybody else create ideas. And I think that's also why it's so important to look at we've talked about it, but the regional mobility manager approach of having someone who understands their specific region of the state, who knows your company, who has a relationship with you and your folks, can work with you, can listen to your ideas, and can create opportunities. One of the other things, I was meeting with some folks the other day, and we were talking about a different topic. But one of the things I'm personally big on is creating opportunities to give grants for innovation so that we unleash the imaginations of our communities and our businesses and our governments and say, look, we want to solve this issue, and you go out and come up with a solution, and you tell us what that is, and we'll help you pay for it. But you got to prove to us it works, and you got to put things in place to show that it works. And there's so many opportunities there in our state, and a lot of folks out there on the ground who are extremely smart in solving problems, but a lot of times we just don't ask, and we don't ask them for their solution. So, Representative Oliver.
Thank you very much. This was very interesting to me. I'm trying to figure out your business model in context of low hourly employees, and particularly your business model, I think, to be successful could very well benefit from some kind of incentive. I mean, I'm thinking about you compared to the incentives we're giving Amazon, or tried to give Amazon. The dollars to you could be far more impactful to your region.
I did hear you mention earlier about if this operation is going to pay people $8-9 an hour, they need to be responsible for transportation as as part of their employment.
The fee is if you were going to pay for transportation as you are now on some level, does that become part of your fee? And how do the business model? How do you make a profit on a $9 an hour employee?
Yes, ma'am.
That's what
So
I'm trying to figure out.
I think the fee system would only work if we had the tax incentive for the employee. And looking at it now, this is kind of an eye opener. We're learning a little bit more than we actually are bringing to the issue. I'll be honest, but that makes plenty of sense to me. Actually, that needs to be part of their employment package.
What percentage of your 200 or so folks you're employing are paid less than $10 or less than $12 an hour?
I would say, I'm sorry, I don't have any. I don't have any
Just
figures
trying to
on
figure
that.
it out, the business model of it.
Most of our jobs, they're not all $8 entry level. I think a very low percentage start out at $8 an hour. I
But
would
what about
think.
$12 an hour?
A very low percentage of that too. The mean for us, $9.50, $10 an hour is good pay in Albany. And it sounds, I've worked in other cities before and it's much higher than that. But for Albany, with cost of living, most people don't complain about starting a job at $9.50 or $10 an hour. Maybe that's because they're just used to making less. Maybe they've settled. Maybe it's another situation like that. But just very few start out at $8.
It's all relevant sometimes to where we're at. Somebody was telling me about a piece of property for sale with 75 acres and a 2-bedroom log house, and they thought it was high, and it was $250,000. And
Yeah.
where I'm from, where I live, that's not high. So it's all relevant. Commissioner Ott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've listened to the last two presentations, and thank you. That was good information. It is 25.
Oh, go ahead.
All right, there we go. I listened to these two, and I mean, it's just amazing to me because I know we're spending our time talking about rural transportation, but when I've been kind of over DOT at Cobb now for 3 years, or coming on the third year, and I just listened to this, and it's exactly what we're dealing with right now in Cobb. I have Tip Top Poultry coming to me saying, hey, you have a bus stop that's two blocks away from our factory, and we have 3 shifts, and in order for the county to try to move that bus route, we have to go through the Title VI discussions. We have to have 2 public hearings and public meetings. I can't just all of a sudden move the bus. And then we talked earlier in some of our other meetings about how some of these smaller counties, and Commissioner Hausman, I look at each other with 13 million, but the fact of the matter is some of these counties, as they do get the things in there, then all of a sudden the federal rules change and now they don't get the money anymore. Or the fact when we look at the last mile, looking at whether you have a flex bus or whether you do Uber or Lyft, how do you do with the transfers? And so what I'm seeing, and I'm hearing it here even in the rural part, is that these regulations that the feds have in place, the strings that are attached, are what's making things difficult in actually providing the service to get folks to like Chattahoochee Tech or get them to Tip Top. And to me, I think that anything that comes out of this commission has to kind of take that into account and find a way to provide for these communities, because although it might be great to get the federal dollars and everything, the strings that are attached make it sometimes impossible to accomplish what you're trying to do. So what I would want to see is whatever comes out of here on the funding side, that we really need to make it incentivize the private side, because they can, if they're using state dollars instead of federal dollars, they can do a lot of things that we can't do when we're trying to use federal dollars.
Yeah, I don't disagree, and I think too that it's important that we find ways to, so that the counties and the end users don't have to deal with the bureaucracy part of it. At the state level we can deal with that, but it's for the counties and the providers. It needs to be as seamless as possible, because it's one of the things, as a person who was a county manager, I know that sometimes it's just not worth it. The juice is not worth the squeeze, and so the easier we can make it for our communities to want to participate or to want to do it on a regional basis, the more chances we have of being successful. Chairman Taylor.
So just a question: how many people are employed, civilian employees at the logistics center, the Marine Logistics Center in Albany.
I
And do
couldn't
they
get-
have a transportation system?
Yes, sir. That's another area that I wanted to kind of go into. I couldn't get solid numbers on just the employment there. Most of these companies that I'm looking at, there's not a document that gives them to you. So I was calling them myself, talking to human resources or getting passed up the chain, and that was just, I couldn't do it for the Marine base.
So I'd like to look at some synergies, because I used to have a contract down there, and a lot of these defense civilian positions are contracted out to defense contractors, and looking at that, and even in the Dean's District in Fort Benning and places like that, some sort of synergy with the quote federal contractors and the civilian, what I'll call the other outside of military employment things. There might be some synergy there. To look at that, because that's a 24/7 operation.
Yes,
as well.
sir.
All right. Well, thank you for your time and what you're doing and for your innovation. So thank you.
Thank you.
All right. At this time, we're going to take a recess for lunch. If the commission members and commission staff, we have lunch in 6:05 that's provided. So here on this floor, 6:05. If you would, though, try to be back here at 11:45. I'm sorry, 12:15. I'm not that big of a slave driver. Yeah, 12:15. Be back in 12:15. Thank you. All right, we'll go ahead and get started back. If everyone could find a seat. I know we have a couple of commission members that'll be wandering in. Poor old Dean Smyrie thought I was serious about the 11:45, so he brought his lunch with him. So, the next on the agenda is I'm going to be going through some updated transit governance recommendations. And in order to do that, I think what I'll do so I can look at you and talk to you is I'm going to go down to the podium to present that to you. And we'll do that now and get started. So. All right, can everyone hear me? All right, we're going to get started here. Sorry. All right, some of this will be a repeat from what we had in Dublin, and but all of it is going to be thought out from and further defined from the conversations we had in Dublin, and then also from the conversations that we've had with individual commission members since that time. And others who have brought forward ideas and suggestions. And as we move from this meeting, moving toward the legislative session and looking at a legislative package around transit, we'll continue to have those conversations, both with commission members, with department heads, agency heads, and others, as we try to perfect the best we can. One of the things that I said to many of the commission members, and I also told the Deloitte team, our consulting group, early on in this process, both last year and then this year, was one of the things I always want to look for is utopia. I want us to find what, if we took all the rules off the table and all the preconceived notions off the table, what would perfect look like? Recognizing we're never going to be able to accomplish utopia. But we need to understand what that looks like and get as close to it as we possibly can under our restraints. And one of the things, as someone who has managed government in my previous life and worked in and around government for almost 30 years now, I can tell you that one of the things that frustrates me personally is the excuses. It's often very easy for people to throw up roadblocks and excuses why things cannot occur because of federal regulations or state regulations or bureaucracy or turf. I've never had a whole lot of patience for that personally, and I always find a way to work through that and around it and go through it. So my goal here is, and I think each member of this commission's goal is to serve the citizens of the state of Georgia and to solve problems, and that's what we intend to do. So as you can see here, our goals here is that we've talked about is consolidate a state transit agency. That's everything outside of the ATL area into one entity. Regional mobility zones, institute regional mobility zones to guide state transit planning investment. We've talked a lot about that, heard a lot about that even today and how that could help in some of the problems that's been brought up and suggestions in this meeting today. Dedicated transit funding and incentives. We heard a lot about that today in this meeting, that we have to have some dedicated funding, that we have to know that it's consistent, that it's there, that it can be counted on year after year. That's going to be very important to be able to move this needle and ball forward. Also being able to bring in the business community. How can we do that? How can we incentivize the private sector to be our partner in this area, and maybe incentivize certain individuals in certain communities who need a hand up for a short period of time to be able to get their GED and to be able to get to their first job, like we heard from the staffing service today. All right, this is a proposed transit model. Again, we talked about this in Dublin. This has a few changes, but the idea here is to pull everything in to one entity, one agency. Here it's referred to as the Georgia Mobility Agency. And underneath that, you see SERTA, the ATL, and what we're calling the Georgia Transit Link, which would be the entity under the Georgia Mobility Agency responsible for handling transit in Georgia outside the ATL area. Nothing in this changes any of the power or operations of the ATL. The ATL was set up last year as House Bill 930, had its first meeting last week, and is off to a good start, and we're looking forward to seeing big things out of that entity. So, and we'll go through all of this in some detail. Overview of the proposed consolidated state agency. This would they would receive and allocate capital and operation funding for transit with dedicated divisions for planning, grants, management, and policy. It would be led by an executive director and by an interagency Georgia Transit Coordinating Council. You can see that there to the right of the Georgia Transit Link. This would be made up of GDOT, DHS, the Department of Behavioral Health, and DCH, all those agencies that are directly involved and have an interest, and their clients have an interest in this service and transit services. And that's important to have all of them at the table involved in this decision-making process. Functional responsibilities, statewide transit planning, conduct an integrated statewide transit planning incorporating local MPO plans and projects. Funding allocation, evaluates and prioritize subrecipient funding applications for capital operations, and of course policy and compliance. They'd be responsible for monitoring compliance with any state funding that went out to any user, community, or otherwise. Proposed authority for federal transit projects. This would be authority for public transit and human services transportation programs will be transferred to this new consolidated agency or consolidated Georgia Transit Link under this proposal you see before you. This would be the employees we've talked about before and the functions under 5307, 5310, 5311. This agency would be the federal recipient or designee for federal funds for transit services outside the ATL. This would have no effect on direct recipients in the state currently, the larger cities that currently receive are direct recipient of federal dollars. This would not change that in any way. This would, again, this agency would be headed up by a director, but it would have a coordinating council made up of all the agency heads where all these dollars currently reside. This going on down, again, we heard a lot today about the need to look at a more local level and have a more regional approach. I know Chairman Shaw and I have talked about even some of the recommendations come out of the Rural Council and how a lot of the conversation is coming around this idea of one community cannot solve all the problems. We need to think more on a regional level, and this approach takes that into account. But regional mobility zones, governance of that would be a mobility zone director and dedicated mobility manager. That would be funded by the state. That person or persons would answer to the state director. They would be distinct and complementary of the regional commissions. So this does not replace regional commissions. It does not replace the functions of regional commissions. It would be a complement to what they're currently doing. Their other responsibilities will all stay intact. Functional responsibilities, the mobility zone staff, the regional staff would develop coordinated transportation plans and incorporate local MPOs. They would also be the entity responsible for purchase of service and contract administration. They would manage those contracts, disperse funding to local operators, as well as oversee non-emergency medical transport within their area. Also, one of the things that we'd want to make clear is in any legislation that nothing would prohibit us from making sure we were able to comply with federal rules, regulations, and laws. So and nothing would prohibit the director from being able to put out a contract, for instance, that was outside the region. If non-emergency medical transport needed to combine 2 regions or 3 regions, or it needed to go across regions, there would be nothing that would prohibit that from occurring. So this would create the opportunity for us to make sure we had the flexibility that needed to be there in order to comply with federal law and regulations. The service delivery coordination, dedicated mobility managers operate a common dispatch software platform, and they become the key communication channel for that region. Again, that goes back to one of the things that Commissioner McMurray had brought up today and we talked about before. If we can find ways to encourage communities to develop a regional approach within that region, within that mobility zone, not force them to do that. So if a community currently has a dial-a-bus program, we're not going to force them to change. It would be more about creating a way to incentivize them to want to cooperate on a more regional level. Mobility zone advisory councils. Each zone would have one. These are chaired by the local mobility zone manager, and their membership would be made up from the regional commission or commissions that the mobility zone operated in. The regional commissions are made up of local elected officials, the county commission chair for each county, the mayor for each city, and then a person appointed by the governor. So all these folks are your local leaderships within that region that's set on the regional commission. Then they internally elect their chairman. Their chairman then would appoint this subcommittee of the regional commission, which would become known as the Mobility Zone Advisory Council. So that gives a great deal of local input and buy-in in that region from the local officials. Regional transit plans, this is the function and responsibilities of the Regional Mobility Council. They would be responsible for reviewing and approving the regional transit plans that was developed by the staff. So again, local leaders ultimately having control over what their local transit plan looks like. The transit project list, advisory council review and approve transit project list submitted to the state for evaluation and funding. And this is something that I know Butch and Curtis and others have had an interest in. One of the things that we did last year in HB 930 was we created the ability for the transit splosh to be able to be used in 2 counties or more that came together and cooperated with each other to develop a transit plan. We found Athens Clarke, Savannah, Chatham, it's been difficult for them to be able to make that work. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure of, though, is we didn't have everyone operating in silos. So to allow Athens Clarke, Savannah, Chatham to have that transit splosh that they feel like would be beneficial for up to 30 years, and ultimately their citizens would decide, then they would submit their list of projects to this regional advisory council, and that regional advisory council, again, made up of those local leaders, would ultimately approve that. And then if they approved it, then that community could go forward with their idea for a longer-term transit splosh. Regional and state planning process. Again, each mobility zone develops an annual regional plan, coordinating with local 5311 agencies as well as all the MPOs to incorporate FTA 5307 transit plans. So bringing everything together, all the resources together, all the plans together to develop a regional plan. Once that happens from the staff, then that plan is reviewed by the advisory council we just talked about. Plans shared with the regional commission, so that can be included in their comprehensive planning efforts. We know that regional commissions are a big part of a regional plan process, so it would be submitted up to them. And then the local director then would send that plan up to the state for evaluation and review, and that would all be incorporated into the complete overall state plan. And decisions based on funding, allocations of funding, operational funding would be made from that plan. So you can see it's very much a bottom-up approach done on the regional level, listening to the local communities, ultimately being approved by the local leaders that make up the subcommittee appointed by the chairman of the regional commission and submitted up to the state. And once all that's done, it's incorporated into a broader state plan. You can see there at the bottom, the regional operating model enables local participation and regional leadership, while the funding and reporting requirements ensure alignment with overall state plans and policy goals. Same thing we talked about a lot during House Bill 930, getting out of the silo effect, talking it on a regional level, and then allocating funding according to that broader plan. Impact of governance recommendations on Georgia transit system. The idea here is to lead to improved transit system performance and expansion of services. And you can see there under the Consolidated State Transit Authority, looking at improved administrative efficiency of transit programs across the state by consolidating them under an entity that's only concern and only responsibility is to provide mobility services and transit services. With state matching funds to zones that provide regional public transit services, counties can be incentivized to look at regionally, leading to further operational efficiencies and expanding coverage areas. So again, some of the very things we've talked about today. And then bundling transit programs and funding may allow the state to leverage greater economics of scales for capital equipment purchases, purchase of services, and allowing us to better manage our scarce resources. And then impacts to the region. Again, integration of the transit provider network and growth in multi-county service delivery. The idea of increasing the idea of regional coordination and creating regional transit operations would be encouraged and incentivized. Mobility management increases efficiency and effectiveness of transit services, and it has also been found to improve transit unit cost, per trip cost, per mile cost, per hour cost by doing it on this scale. And again, we talked about the common routing and dispatch, further improve this idea of regional service coordination. Mobility zone designs, talk a few minutes about that. Considerations for that, looking at the boundaries of mobility zones can designate minimum disruption. We talked in Dublin quite a bit about how we should design the zones, going even back to the conversation about how the districts were designed in the ATL, looking at travel patterns, commuter patterns, other things outside just political boundaries. Commissioner Hausman's mentioned several times and even today about how the only people who knew where the county line was really was the people who were elected. The citizens don't care. They just want to go to work. They want to go shop. They want to go to health care, to the GED center, wherever it is they need to be at. They don't concern themselves with what county they're in at the particular time. Maintain regional commissions. We mentioned that earlier. This would in no way affect regional commissions. Their boundaries would stay the same. Their responsibilities would stay the same. What we did do, though, and we'll see this as we look at the lines for the mobility zones, we made sure that we were either creating a mobility zone that exactly matched up to the boundaries of a single regional commission, or it encompassed two regional commissions. So that way there's clear lines of communication between a single or two county regional commissions, and you'll see that. Connect regional services to local travelers. Again, looking at the zone borders that will conform with local travel patterns as best as we possibly can. Where are people that's living in County A driving to go or traveling to go to the doctor? Where are they going to health care? Where are they going to educational opportunities? Where are staffing services having to place these people for job opportunities? All those things should be taken into consideration as we're looking at mobility zones. Improving economic and social outcomes. Again, looking at the things we just talked about and building upon existing transit infrastructure. You know, Butch talked about today the 7 counties around Athens-Clarke and how they were feeder communities to come into Athens to work for other things, but they didn't have transit opportunities. So how can we build on what Athens-Clarke already has in place and feed the Athens-Clarke transit system with workers and others from outside Athens-Clarke, from that region, that mobility zone around Athens-Clarke as that hub, to be able to improve not only Athens-Clarke, but also the life of the people who are living in that rural part of the state. Balanced state resources, similar population and growth forecast in all the mobility zones. Dedicated transit regions will strengthen rural communities. by improving connectivity to healthcare, education, workforce development, and jobs, which is our goal. All right, this shows you the 9 mobility zones that's being recommended. This is very similar to one of the maps you saw in Dublin. Again, these mobility zones have quite a few benefits and very few challenges. The benefits being we're expanding mobility zone boundaries to encompass 6 regional commissions. Zones better match travel patterns. Cross travel is reduced to 12,000 total residents. Independence, again, they're unencumbered by the current issues with the regional commissions, the current functions of the regional commissions. Planning, it may encompass more than one regional commission. If it does, I mentioned earlier, I think the chairman of the regional commission would appoint the subcommittee. If the mobility zone takes up 2 regional commissions, then both chairmen will appoint members to serve on one committee that becomes that advisory council. So they would be members, local elected officials made up of both communities. And then limited service expansion. This would not have an effect on what we currently are doing. We talk about that and some of the challenges with T-Splosh regions. Again, this may be not necessarily mirror up exactly with the regional commission. It may take in 2. That really doesn't have any effect on what we're currently doing with T-Splosh because that's outside of this area of conversation. But what we are saying is we would not affect that in any way. So the law, we're not proposing any changes to the law around T-Splosh. It would still be done within the boundary of the regional commission, and all of that would remain in place. Like you heard Commissioner McMurray said earlier, we have 3 currently and 1 coming online that regions have voted for the TIA. This is your 9. We numbered those, and that's the area or the regional commission or commissions they take into account. You can see that there are the 2 or 3 that have more than 1 regional commission. You can see the results of that there. Role and responsibility of mobility zones. You can see that mobility management, administration of human services, transportation, DHS, oversight of non-emergency medical transportation, transit-related planning, administration of regional public transit service, and then you also can see in comparison what the regional commissions currently do. And again, that's unchanged. They still have all their responsibilities. And this is hopefully a complement to what they're currently doing, but does not take away from what regional commissions are doing. The 2 entities would coordinate, especially as it relates to the integration of regional transit plans and comprehensive transportation planning. All right. Transit funding and incentives. This is some recommendations around funding. 6 funding sources have been selected and estimated for potential revenue. Again, there's a whole host of revenue, and that's why number 3 is other fees. We could spend many hours talking about different options for revenue for this area. One of the things that we want to make sure of, though, is when we have these conversations that it's something that we have at least a chance or a likelihood of being able to get it implemented. And that, I think that's important. We can throw out a lot of ideas, but if we don't have the political ability to make those happen necessarily, then we can spend a lot of time talking about something and never accomplish anything. Regional transit or regional T-Splosh, and this is the Transportation Special Purpose Local Option Sales Tax that's currently in place in these regions. Also, individual counties now have the ability to do that under current law. This is what Commissioner McMurray was talking about earlier. We now have 4 regions in the state doing that. You also heard him say that they have the ability to fund transit in that current T-Splosh. The challenge for that, and we've heard Butch talk about this before, is that only goes out for a shorter period of time, so it's more difficult to draw down federal funds. But they do have that. That is a funding option on the table to help these communities, whether it be a single county or whether it be a region, participate in a regional T-Splosh. Single county transit splosh, this is what we talked about again in HB 930, and this is what we talked about just a few minutes ago, that we would allow a single county to do a transit splosh, but their project list would have to meet the regional plan and it would have to be approved by the council at the regional commission level. Other fees, we'll talk a little bit about that. State transit bonds, again, the state has the ability through the general appropriations process to issue bonds. You know, a lot of our rural communities, their needs are not necessarily major capital. They're more in line with the ongoing operations costs, but there may be opportunities in places like Columbus or Savannah or Athens or Macon to be able to help in some of those areas. Then we want to talk a little bit about pilot programs for tax credit and direct transit assistance. Regional T-Splosh, these are just some estimates if the entire state, excluding the ATL, was to pass, just to show you how, you know, the kind of numbers we're talking about annually. Of course, it wouldn't all be used just for transit, but some proportion could be. It could yield $706 million annually. Again, regions can better leverage transit funds, and the current 12 regional commission structure yields an average of $64 million per regional commission. And then you can see that the proposed mobility zone would yield $105 million because, again, some of those regional mobility zones encompass more than one regional commission. This is the single county transit splosh we talked about. Again, we went through House Bill 930. No county has yet to do this. Again, the feedback we've been getting on that has been the barriers, because most of these larger urban centers are surrounded by small communities that are not interested or really don't have the resources to participate. And it's been a barrier, and we heard those communities, and we want to be able to find a solution to that. And we think this will be a way to do that, again, without creating the additional silo effect. Legislation can be adjusted to do that, and again, we went through that with the Mobility Zone Advisory Council. If the 10 other metro counties that currently have the 5307 transit service were to implement a transit splosh, then they could raise an additional $235 million on an annual basis. So there are opportunities if a community has an interest in creating a great deal of revenue for transit purposes in their community. All right, this is state pilot program for tax credit for transit benefits and economic development. We talked a little bit about this in Dublin, and then with the work that Brian has done with the Subcommittee on Workforce Development, and listening to how we need to try to find a way to incentivize the business community to be involved. This would allow for the Georgia Transit Link at the state level to administer a competitive pilot program in which local employers receive tax credits to provide transit benefits. The regional mobility zone and the local employers and the transit providers would be involved in that. The idea here is, and we hit on this in the presentation earlier, was to create an opportunity for competition, an opportunity for innovation, where we allow the regional mobility managers to work within their communities and within their business community to create some competition and some innovation, and to put together a program that they feel like would work, and then in turn we would be able to incentivize that. So we're still working through that and looking for ways to incentivize employers to be able to provide these services to their employees. This is direct transit assistance for the unemployed. The idea here would be a 3-year transit benefits pilot program where the unemployed and economically distressed areas receive a monthly transit pass to connect to job opportunities. What we looked at here was the targeted distressed counties, those that were above 125% of the state's unemployment rate or below 75% of the per capita income. These are very poor communities with very high unemployment and great needs. And these communities typically fall in the South Georgia area of our state. This would be a 3-year pilot program. Eligible recipients would receive $75 a month in transit assistance, and that would cost approximately $1.5 million. Again, the mobility managers would be responsible for helping to establish the routes to employers and workforce development centers, and helping find opportunities to get the transportation where it needs to be. And you can see there the current counties on the right side there. 22 counties fit this criteria. Approximately 27,000 unemployed people across 5 mobility zones. Mobility zone field staff would identify the eligible residents and work to establish a program. And again, they would receive a monthly transit voucher to assist in finding and applying for a job. They would be able to get to job interviews, continuing education, or workforce development classes. This is not providing a ride to Walmart or providing a ride to a friend's house or anywhere like that. The idea here is that these people need to get to a GED learning center, they need to get to technical college, and they need to get to a job. That it would be limited for that purpose. So it's not a general, we're going to assist you with transit anywhere you want to go. It's specific. One of the things that I want to talk just a minute about, because all these things cost money, and I think it's important that we are able to have those kind of conversations. Last year, this commission worked through several ideas about how to fund some of the opportunities for transit services. One being, and we brought forward legislation in HB 930. It actually passed the House, but in conference committee it came out. But it was the idea of the ride share fee. That's something that we want to revisit this session. We feel like that statewide that can generate approximately $60 million. And again, we at that time had all the parties at the table interested in participating and supporting that. There's some, you've read in the paper, some ongoing disputes over past revenue that may be outstanding between some of the companies and the state. I know there's a concern by some of the companies to be at the table and have those conversations until that's resolved. But I do feel like we can move forward with a earnest conversation around this area next session. That would put all of our ride-sharing companies, whether it's taxis, Uber, Lyft, on the same level playing field with each other. But it would also generate money that we would dedicate and codify that money had to be used, or it would go away for transit purposes. So that would be a dedicated funding source that we'd be able to count on year after year, and that's again a conversation that we're going to have. The other thing that you may have not have caught, but I'll try to go back to it real quick. One of the other things that one of the other goals of this entire presentation, and things that the commission members have said throughout this process, we heard it last year, we've heard it this year, is that we want to try to get to a place of consolidating and streamlining government so that we can utilize those funds to actually get out to the end users and provide services to citizens. One of the things you'll see under the Georgia Mobility Agency is there's no GRETA. Again, House Bill 930 last year in the House had done away with that agency. Quite frankly, it no longer serves a purpose. We've been in conversations with newly elected leaders talking about that, and it's our intent to move forward with some recommendations that agency, we go back to our original House Bill 930 position in the House, and that GRETA doesn't serve a purpose. It cannot be done with one of these other agencies. So that would further streamline that process. Under current law, CERTA, GRETA, and the ATL could all have a different director. So you could have 3 distinct agencies working separately with different directors. That could be problematic, and so that's why I think it's important to streamline this under one agency and to make sure they're all just have the one director. So we're going to be working with that as we work through the GRETA conversation over the next couple of months. All right, I'm gonna go back up there, and then I can answer any questions you have. All right, we have Representative Oliver.
It's obvious to me to see the benefit of consolidating the federal funding source streams that are under the Human Services umbrella for some efficiencies. But for this to succeed in the way that you want it to and I want it to is there's going to have to be local leadership from the business community on the economic development side. If this is going to really responding to the good discussion we had earlier, if the poorer regions of the state are really going to be able to take advantage of workforce issues, they're going to have to partner. Is there enough coordination with economic development and the rural? I'm trying to remember what agency Amy Carter's new job answers to economic development to create that local energy partnership.
Well, and that's a very good and valid point. And, you know, one of the things I think that's important is the people, and sometimes a frustrating thing about being on the policy side of things like we are is we create legislation, we create agencies, we create ideas, but ultimately the success of them is going to depend on the people who are hired and appointed downstream to carry out those missions. We can have the best intentions, but if the right people are not put in place, then we're not going to be successful. So I think that creating the regional approach, having a regional mobility manager and staff creates the opportunity for great success, where that regional mobility manager working in that area on a daily basis can develop relationships with the economic development teams in the communities, can develop relationships with a lot of our rural regional commissions, do a good job with economic development, and they'll be there working with them on a regular basis. But any other ideas or thoughts on that, I'm 100% open to that, because we do want to create the best possible opportunity for success. Ultimately, it's going to depend on the people who ultimately are those mobility managers, I think. Representative Smyrie.
Mr. Chairman, on the capitalization versus operational, when we did the 930, of course, we had some funding resources in it. On a proposition like this, when you're talking about the local counties having some sort of collaboration in a certain region, how do you identify those pilot programs? How do you and how do you provide for that direct transit assistance? I want to follow up with Representative Oliver. To me, I think what you just identified hits to the core of the problem, and how we go about doing it and how we go about replicating it around the state, to me, has major value. But as we talked earlier, touting this as economic development and workforce development priority, I think elevates it to the point where it becomes jobs and job creation and quality of life, that kind of thing. But how do you take that I think you said you have some state pilot programs, and then out of that state pilot program, there will be some direct transit assistance. And would that go to like the municipalities or the counties, or what's the CUN doing? What?
Well, and that's a valid point also, Representative Smyrie. You know, one of the things, and the reason we did it as a pilot program and as a competitive program in the recommendation, was because one of the things, sometimes I'm overly critical of government, but I'm going to be a little critical of government here as somebody who's worked in it for many, many years. We create a lot of programs, but oftentimes we don't go back to see if they really work. They sound good on paper, and they make us look good sometimes, but I think if we can create competition around our regional mobility managers around the state to force them to work with their economic development teams and others to create an innovative program that they create in their region that may work. It may be working with a staffing agency like we heard from earlier. They send that up to the state entity, to the director at the state level, and then we have some funds set aside that will allow them to fund that program for a period of time. And then we're monitoring to see if it works. As we find things that work, then we as a state need to be prepared to fund those things, to fund those programs across the state. And I think the only way we're going to be able to do that is we've got to have dedicated funding, which we talked about. But I think we unleash the innovation and have some competition among our regions. And there may be other things, though, that we find and identify that we want to implement. Again, I think creating a dedicated funding source is probably as high up on the priority list as anything we can do as a state, because without money, none of these things are going to be accomplished.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Let's see. Mr. Anderson, is that you? 23? Okay, I'm sorry.
23.
Commissioner Hausman.
Thank you. I must admit, I'm having difficulty seeing a couple of those slides. If you could go back to, full disclosure. If you could go back to the governance with the state director and how that, I'm trying to see it. I just would like to have a little clarity on exactly how that would work. And I'm asking the question because the ATL is so new, and it, already had a lot of authority. And I obviously don't see MARTA on there unless it's smaller than I can read.
No. MARTA's not a state entity.
Well, it's controlled in some respects
That's
now
right,
by
but
the ATL.
right.
So, but anyway, so the ATL then would report. How would that work?
Well, in this particular case, currently there is one director that's over all the agencies, currently. But under current law, each agency's board could hire a separate director. If so, CERTA could hire a separate director, GRETA could have a separate director, the ATL could have a separate director. The idea here is we have one director for all the agencies.
For those three.
For those three. GRETA goes away. Georgia Transit Link is responsible for transit outside the ATL region. The powers and the relationship with MARTA, all the things that are currently in the ATL, nothing changes there. It's just the director structure there is clarified so that there's one person.
Well, when you say GRETA goes away, what does that mean?
Well, the legislation we passed last year in the House, GRETA went away.
Well, it went to CERTA.
That's right, same thing.
Okay, so CERTA and GRETA both go away?
No. CERTA's remains.
Okay.
It would be the same as what we passed in the House last year.
But then they would all report to this Georgia Mobility Agency.
Correct. No new personnel there. The idea there with the agency versus a authority is not to have authorities underneath authorities, to just have an agency, and also that way from a budget perspective it wouldn't be administratively attached to another entity.
There would be an agency head though, correct?
Which would be the director. We're calling it the Georgia Mobility Agency. Today it's the director of CERTA, the director of the ATL, and the director of GRETA.
So that position that is currently there would just change title?
Correct.
Okay, all right. Go ahead.
What number are you, Tomas?
25.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm having the same problems she is following it, because if you have 3 directors today and you're going to go to 1 director, so then 2 out of the 3 are going to no longer be in charge of their area. You're gonna
There's
have a
only
single
one.
director.
There's only one director today. The idea there is, though, currently under current law, each of them could have a separate director. So the ATL board could decide we're going to hire our own director. Chris would
because the
still be
ATL
the director of. Chris would still be the director of the. He would still be the director of GRETA. He would still be the director of CERTA. What we're saying is to streamline the process, there would just be one person.
Okay.
Follow-up question. The Georgia link and the ATL link are separate, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so the ATL would not be underneath the Georgia link, it would be equal or on the
Correct.
same level?
They would be separate departments underneath the Georgia Mobility Agency as far as, right now, the ATL is administratively attached to GRETA. And Greta will no longer exist, so they will be attached to the Georgia Mobility Agency. So as far as how the ATL operates, nothing changes at all. It's just the structure there of how it's worded in a state budget. And I'm happy to have more conversations with you about that.
Oh, no, that's fine. I assume we're going to get a copy of this presentation so we can review it and if
Yeah.
we have any questions.
Oh, yeah, that's
All right,
fine.
thank you.
Let's see. Mr. Anderson, do you have a question?
Oh, well, a question or a comment, just the conversation around economic development and regional commissions. I can only speak to two, but really we lead economic development, not the regional commission, and that's a concern. The second would be the fact that you would only have elected officials or regional commission folks making these decisions because they don't have relationships with employers, with the economic development community. So just a little concern there. There's no business representation in the governance.
No, that's a good point. And the thing that we need to make sure too we understand is that there's not attached to the RCs. So the regional mobility managers, the staff does not work for the regional commission. The idea is that the regional commission has a subcommittee that can approve the regional plan because those are the people who are locally elected that actually put the money in for those services, and they need to have some input in order to have buy-in. But no, the regional mobility manager is going to have to develop relationships with the economic development folks, with the chamber, depending on the community who's leading that effort.
Okay.
All right, 27.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A few observations. Economic development, the backbone of public transportation and transit is key to our success here. I'm looking at an article from December 14th from Bloomberg. We are one of the net receivers of, migration from northern cities, mostly from the Northeast. City of Atlanta, Metro Atlanta adds about 147 people a day to the population. And when you look at that going forward, you can look at roads, you can look at all that, but at the end of the day, that's 147 people a day that on average move in here in the metro area. You're going to have to plan long term for that because I don't think that trend is going to change. My pet peeve, and I've mentioned it before, but I just want to enter in the record: Medicaid dumping, Medicare dumping, where you have providers that are charging per mile for transportation, but then they'll dump them all on MARTA Mobility. The folks on MARTA Mobility pay about $3 a piece for that ride. These Medicare providers are charging the federal government, and I don't know where we coordinate with that, but the net cost to MARTA Mobility to transport these folks is about $32 a trip. So there's a net loss every single trip of about $30. Distance-based fares, as we look at a new model, there's no reason if I'm riding from North Springs to the airport that I should pay the same as if I'm riding from 5 Points to Peachtree Center. Look at that and peak times as well. The demographic changes, I think I've covered that with the immigration thing. I love flattening the organization and smoothing that out. I think if you have one person or one entity coordinating this, it's very good because when people think of Atlanta, they think of not the city limits of Atlanta. They think of Marietta is Atlanta, Cumberland Mall is Atlanta, Dunwoody's Atlanta. But again, we've got an opportunity here to change some things in a fundamental way, and I'd like to see some of that happen.
All right, thank you, Chairman Taylor.
And one that I just took back from a recent trip to Japan, their national transportation system actually has performance-based compensation, which is basically if trains are not running on time, people get reduced fares. The fares automatically go back onto your cards and things like that. When I was there last year, we had a train that ran 20 seconds late, and they made a national apology for it. 20 seconds. But again, holding the people that hold the reins of this accountable, but also holding the system accountable if people are running late for jobs or things like that, because dependability is really important, being there timely and efficiently and safely. But looking at refunding some of that fare to people if the trains are running off schedule.
Thank you.
Sir.
And the one of the things too, just to kind of re-clarify and point out, this is the idea behind the governance structure. There is you've got one mobility agency, one executive director, with 3 separate departments underneath. No different than Commissioner McMurray currently has at GDOT, where he's the commissioner, but he operates a lot of different functions, or any other, a county manager at Fulton County has different agencies he's responsible for, but he ultimately is in charge of those. So that's what we're trying to do, is streamline the process. All right, let's see, 24.
Me again. No offense and to my good friend, Mr. Taylor, down the table here, but if we're trying to encourage more ridership, I would hesitate to have a different fare structure, at least initially. Maybe down the road that could be considered, but especially as we try to expand and all the things we're trying to do, I would just be hesitant to do that. I also think that back at the beginning stages of 930, we talked about some fees associated with services at the airports. And I know that did not really go anywhere last year, but I would hope that we might revisit that as well and see if there's a way to factor that in, because that is one of the major destination points people have. And so there's a direct connection between getting to an airport and the way you get there. So I think that's something worth exploring. And I know there's obstacles, but all good things take a lot of work. So I would like for us to look at that. And then I do have a question about the T-SPLOST versus for transit versus the regular transportation SPLOST. Would counties have the option to do both, or would they combine them? How would that work?
No, they could do both.
Any county could do both.
Yeah, this has no effect on the ATL area.
No, I'm talking about outside
but
the
outside of the ATL, this would be the process any county could go through. So yes, they could do both. Athens Clark, for instance, currently have T-SPLOST, or if they don't, they probably will. They could then in turn have a transit SPLOST. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
All right, Chairman Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Actually, my main question, because we had trouble reading the screen as well, so you've answered most of those questions in terms of that proposed governance model. I guess I'll just add, like you mentioned earlier, our conversations about our work on the House Rural Development Council and all the good work that's gone into that the last couple of years as well. And through that, there's also a push to these go hand in hand, because we're working on a lot of the same issues on working on the rural transit piece. But there's been a lot of success in the state, or several cases where regionalism and counties working together on economic development has really produced some significant results. And so there's some incentives proposed there to copy that in some other parts of the state, and it goes hand in hand with what we're talking about here. We're talking about how are you going to incentivize these small rural counties that have never invested at all in transit and public transportation. How do you get them to start thinking differently? And as we look at more of a regional approach to this, I think the regional commissions obviously have those relationships with all them, but at the end of the day, we have got to figure out a way to incentivize them somehow to actually think differently going forward. But it goes back to what I was talking about regionally in terms of economic development, because if one of the issues we're facing in these rural areas is you don't have enough skilled workforce to attract these new industries that are looking at areas, and they've got all this data now. They can just get it online for free. So, but if we can figure out how to apply these new changes we're proposing to that, whereas now that we've got this is not going to happen overnight, but look 5 years from now, if you've got a regional network and you've got some of these rural counties participating, then that has to help that picture in terms of your workforce
availability for your region. So I think we just need to make sure we're all looking at this together with what's going on with the rural council. But it's a good start. Only thing else I'll add is that I know with the regional commissions, my relationship with mine, they're out here. I mean, they've been to every meeting is strong, but their relationship with GDOT is strong, and there's that long-standing relationship between those two in dealing with 5311 and these other programs. So I think we need to be careful there in terms of making sure we're not creating something else that will take a while for those relationships to be, to come on board. So that's all I've got to say, but thanks for all your work on this.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Director Thomason.
Yeah, from here it is hard to see the slides a little bit. Putting aside,
You saw them before, though.
yeah, I've seen some of it, but I was going to say, putting aside future personnel decisions, which may color how I personally feel about it. Looking at the slide, if the construct is understand where the different federal pots of money that all go into transit come in to one centralized place, and it was really the other slide with the 9 regions, and thinking about the ATL board members, it's basically looking at the dollars coming in centrally, that one, or and then the mobility zones allows for a catered regional approach by region, because just like the ATL issues and the congestion level and the things we're dealing with, that's one set of issues. It's going to be very different out on the coast or in the heart of Georgia, et cetera. So it's sort of a centralized under one house. Everything's focused on transit, but then allowing for those differences on a regional by regional basis. Is that?
Yeah, no, I agree. And I think one of the things that is important, too, to note, we have a lot of tax credits in the state. Typically, we just put a cap on them, and it's first come, first served. Once they're used up, they're used up. The recommendation here is we allow for competition among mobility zones to create programs so that it's not necessarily first come, but it's the best program gets to be the pilot or the pilots, and then we test how that works and see if we want to implement it statewide. So it's a little bit of it's a little different than our normal tax credit program, but I think it allows us to have that regional flair. 29, is that you, Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I would say thanks for this committee's work, or commission's work, rather. I think we've come a long way and have a great understanding of, again, trying to solve transit at the local and regional level. And I would encourage this commission and the legislature, as we move forward into the legislative process, to look for these solutions, that we keep that at front and center of how do we deliver locally and regionally the most efficient way we can. I do need to be on record as my concern of standing up a new agency in advance of that, as again, until you have local participation fully through a regional commission or a mobility zone, you may be standing up an organization that yet does not have something to fully do. And I would say, as I mentioned earlier, our efforts to try to get 5311 to 159 counties has been just that, efforts, but it comes back down to the reality of funding and to make those things happen. So I would just caution that concern. That may sound a little bit like turf war. We are the Department of Transportation, so I do consider transit as one of our intermodal duties to still try to provide. But I will keep an open mind because it's that important. It's very much critical and important to the economy of the state for the things that have been articulated this morning, that we look for these solutions as we go forward. I fully endorse, the Transit Coordinating Council idea and notion that's put here before, which could be GDOT, DHS, DCH, with governance from the governor, the speaker, and lieutenant governor, to be able to pull agencies together as a state, as a team, as we should, because we should be one Georgia, not individual organizations or agencies in the state, to focus on how to solve this. And I think, again, you suggested some great pilots of the tax incentives and the unemployment opportunities, but maybe we pilot this, and we've got 3 regions now that deliver transportation, 5311 transportation at the regional level. If we can get DCH and DHS collaboratively together at the pilot and take those and use that as the catalyst and the springboard, maybe that's a great next step to really, again, solve the issue of transit while other things take place when you look up and down this organizational chart that's put forward. So again, a lot of work from the first meeting to here. If we think about how 2 years back now, a lot of great outcomes, and look forward to continuing the dialogue going forward. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. I think, too, one of the things we didn't mention under funding ideas we need to keep in mind, though, is the money that we talked about for incentivizing the regional coordination with 5311 money. I think that could be a big win for us as a state to further incentivize those local communities to participate on a regional level. Any other questions? All right. We'll get back up to speed here. All right. Well, we're going to be moving forward into legislative session here very quickly. We'll start continuing to have these conversations with commission members and with members of our legislative leadership, both in the House and Senate, and with the incoming governor's office to see what direction that they'd like to see us go in. But those conversations will continue, and we'll look forward to a very productive session coming up. We're going to, again, this will be our last meeting of the year. We're looking for a path forward for the 2019 legislative session. We've laid out a lot of ideas today, and we also covered a lot of that in Dublin. We'll continue to have additional conversations with agencies, with Commissioner McMurray, with others and members of the commission. I think you can see that based on what we heard today and the conversation we heard among the commission, sometimes the solutions are not easy. Oftentimes it means change for some agency functions. But one of the things just to point out that, we're creating a name on a piece of paper, the Georgia Mobility Agency, but it's not new personnel. They all exist today. They all have functions today. They're all in place. It's just streamlining the process is the idea behind that. We'll have a lot of conversations about that as we move forward in the legislative process. So we do plan to get back together in January, right around the beginning of session. Between our Deloitte team and our House research folks, they've been working hard for the last 2 years for us. They'll be putting together a full report, which we'll need to review, make sure it's the workings of this commission. We'll have Chelsea send that out prior to the next meeting for your review. If you have any suggestions or changes that need to be made or corrections, please let us know. If not, we'll bring that for you on at the next meeting for your approval and to move forward. And then we'll move into the legislative session. We also are having conversations with our House leadership team now. I believe I said it in Dublin. I said it in Atlanta at the meeting before that. But we had 3 legs to the stool that we talked about in our Transit Commission enabling legislation. The first one was the Metro Atlanta area, which we talked about a great deal the first year. The second one was everything outside Metro Atlanta, which we've talked a great deal about over the past year. And the third was around freight rail. And that's a conversation that we need to have moving forward. The Port of Savannah continues to grow, and we need to continue to find ways to work with GDOT and to work with others across the state to move more of our freight by rail. So we'll be having those conversations of how to restructure this commission, and we'll be having conversations with the Senate on that issue. But that is the goal of the House, is to have a seat at the table there as we start that conversation. So, Commissioner Hausman, do you have something else?
Well, you answered my question initially, was just, is this going to be extended? So I appreciate that. And if that's the will of the speaker, I'm certainly willing to continue. But I did want to mention again just how important your work has been and your leadership on this effort. And the advancements that have been made to date are historical. And what we're talking about is also going to add to that. And it wouldn't have been possible without your diligence and your commitment to it. And, you know, I live in the metro, and I, of course, am focused on Fulton County, but the whole state as well. And I just want to thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, and I want to thank the speaker because, you know, at the 2 years ago, he stood up, and I mentioned this at the ATL board meeting the other day, but in my dozens and dozens of conversations last year during the HB 930 conversation, Michael Thurman, the CEO of DeKalb, said, I never thought I'd live to see the day that the Speaker of the House would stand up at Eggs and Issues and say that transit was a priority. And and he said, I don't know what the outcome's going to be, but I want to be a part of it. So, you know, Speaker Ralston started talking about this issue about 3 years ago. And, you know, he has put his shoulders down and helped us push this through some difficult times. So I appreciate his leadership, and I'm looking forward to having him involved in getting a legislative package through this session, and then taking on the freight rail issue, because it's all work well worth doing. But I appreciate his leadership on this issue. Got you.
I just wanted to also say that as much as I enjoyed our conversations when you were stuck in traffic on Georgia 400 last session, trying to get down here to the Capitol to do the people's business, I certainly look forward to the day where you don't have to call me to complain about that traffic.
So do I. I ran into a wreck at McFarland and 400 today. So, Representative Smyrie.
I just want to add to follow with the commissioner's comments. Attending the ATL initial board meeting was just great. I mean, to sit there and to see, and then for you and Senator Beach to kick it off and talk about the legislative input on it. And when you think about it, you know, back in 2014 and in 2015 Transportation Act, and the speaker appointed this committee, and transit had never, you know, been discussed over the years. I mean, for 30 some odd years, and now for transportation had kind of been pushed down in our priority. Now to have transportation back up in the top of the issues in the state of Georgia is very, very promising, because as I said in the well one time, that, you know, transportation won't guarantee you economic development, but without it, I can guarantee you won't have economic development. So to me, to have, and to the speaker's credit and to your credit, elevating this is I don't think the story's really been told, but I think it bodes well for the state of Georgia. With that being said, the ATL was a great combination, and attending that meeting, I just sit there and reflected back of all the politics, all the innovation going on, and I can envision now what we are trying to do as a commission, as a governance commission, and how we try to replicate and how we try to take this across the state of Georgia. We're going to have to be even more innovative and more thankful of what we do and how we carry out and what methodology we use in that process. But I consider it very promising. We've come a long, long way in the state, especially on transit and transportation. To me, I think people's lives will be better because of what we're doing. And so I just want to thank you and your work and the work of this commission and of your transportation committee and the members of the House and the Senate, because we've come a long, long, long way. And I think that's to the betterment of the state of Georgia too, and we need to continue in that process.
Well, I appreciate that. You know, I was at a meeting the other day presenting on transportation issues at Transportation for America. Is transportation leaders from all over the country. They wanted to hear what we were doing in Georgia. And we were talking about all the way back to the fact that our infrastructure was crumbling. And then we had TIA, which wasn't hugely successful in most parts of our state. You know, and that would have been enough to kind of set a lot of politicians back and just said, well, we're not going to do anything. But again, with Speaker Ralston's leadership in pushing House Bill 170 and the help of people like you, Dean, and others who pushed House Bill 170, we became a model for the country. dealing with highways and bridges. But that left out a big way the transit conversation. Then we had the vote in Atlanta, City of Atlanta, to add an additional tax for MARTA and to expand MARTA, the expansion of MARTA into Clayton County. And then with the House Bill 930 and the ATL creation, and now in March, the possibility of expansion of MARTA into Gwinnett County, the conversations that's actively going on with Cobb County, we've got a real opportunity. And we're moving forward at a very fast pace. And instead of being left behind, there's a lot of folks coming to Georgia to find out how we're doing it. So a lot of credit goes to a lot of people, but I want to especially, again, thank Speaker Ralston and Governor Deal for their leadership in this area, and folks like Commissioner McMurray, who's led at the GDOT level. And if I brag on him enough, he might support my plan too. But through this effort. That's all right. We'll talk during the budget time. Any other questions? All right. Well, we'll send out notice. Again, we'll try to meet again at the beginning of session. But again, thank you for everything you've done, and I hope every one of you and your families have a very Merry Christmas. Thank you.